Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. With just a week to go until Election Day, the former President Donald Trump heads to key battleground state of Pennsylvania as Kamala Harris rallies in Washington in what her team is calling the former prosecutor's closing argument. Israel's parliament votes to ban the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency from operating in Israel and the occupied East Jerusalem, alleging its collusion with Hamas. That's raising concerns about the delivery of aid to war-torn Gaza. And Hezbollah names Naim Qassem as the group's new leader, this after the killing of Hassan Nasrallah last month. Hello and welcome. The US Republican presidential candidate, former President Donald Trump, has given a press conference after facing criticism for a litany of comments made by speakers at his rally on Sunday in New York. Comments that were seen by many as being misogynistic and racist. Well, later today, the Democratic nominee, Vice President Kamala Harris, will draw a comparison between her vision and that of her Republican rival when she delivers a speech at the same park near the White House where the former President Trump rallied his supporters just before the attack on the US Capitol on the 6th of January 2021. Our correspondent Kate Fisher filed this report.
In Jose Crespo's barbershop, they're not happy with Donald Trump. At the former president's rally, comedian Tony Hinchcliffe disparaged the island where Jose's family is from.
There's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Jose says he feels disrespected.
It's called us garbage. Yeah, you go to Puerto Rico, you're going to see how beautiful everything is. Down to the people, to the mountains, everything is beautiful. The food, the culture. So I really don't understand where this comes from. It just sounds like hate.
The former president has bragged about the size of the crowd, but not apologized for the comments.
We've had the greatest rallies in the history of the world, not just this country. There's never been... I mean, we filled up Madison Square Garden last night. We could have filled it up 10 times. If you looked outside, you saw all the way back to the Hudson River.
Kamala Harris. Campaigning at a semiconductor factory in the swing state of Michigan, Vice President Kamala Harris tried to draw a comparison with her Republican rival.
My opponent spends full time talking about just kind of diminishing who we are as a man. And talking down at people. Talking about, I don't know, we're the garbage can of the world. We're not.
And the vice president is planning to continue to highlight the differences between her and the former president when she addresses thousands of her supporters on the Ellipse. That's the park just south of the White House, where on January the 6th, 2021, Donald Trump mobilized a mob to riot at the US Capitol building. The symbolism helping her to make her closing argument to the American people as one of the closest US presidential races in decades has reached its final week. Kate Fisher, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
Well, our chief correspondent, Simon Marx, is standing by for us in D.C. and joins us now. Simon, good to have you with us. Donald Trump spending today in Pennsylvania. Just tell us how the race is shaping up there.
Well, he's got some work to do in Pennsylvania. There is no question about that, Tom, because Pennsylvania is home to, among others, an estimated 500,000 voters from Puerto Rico. And as you heard in that report from Kate Fisher, there is tremendous anger within the Puerto Rican community about those comments that were made by a comedian, part of the warm-up act for Donald Trump at Madison Square Garden on Sunday. The Trump campaign says that he was not reflecting the former president's view of Puerto Rico, but it was notable earlier today when Donald Trump held a fairly wide-ranging availability for reporters and supporters at Mar-a-Lago down in Florida, that he would only describe Sunday night's event in New York as a place where there was so much love in the room. He didn't do anything in his appearance in Florida this morning to push back and to try and assuage the concerns of not just Puerto Rican voters, but other Hispanic and Latino Americans who support Donald Trump has worked so hard to try and secure, that in fact he genuinely joins the condemnation of what that comedian had to say. Schools in the town of Allentown in Pennsylvania, where former President Trump will be appearing later today, have been closed for the day. The school district says out of an abundance of caution. There are expected to be protests by Puerto Ricans and others close to the site where Donald Trump will be appearing. But he is definitely under pressure to address this issue directly, and it's going to be very interesting to see whether he does that when he's in Pennsylvania later today, to try and take the sting out of it, because in this very closely contested election, in the very closely contested battleground state of Pennsylvania, you know, this has the potential to become an issue that denies him victory, and that would be a massive problem, a massive own goal for his campaign.
OK, so that's the Trump campaign effort today. Let's talk about Kamala Harris. She's going to be rallying in Washington, and they're calling this her closing argument. Just tell us what we can expect from that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because usually in presidential elections, you know, the closing argument comes the night before the election with a massive rally. I think Kamala Harris is trying to get at least 2 bites of the cherry here. She's going to address a crowd estimated to be possibly 40,000 strong. That's the size of the permit that they've been granted by the Washington, D.C. authorities. And she's going to be standing pretty much in exactly the same spot where Donald Trump was standing on January the 6th, 2021. When he said to his supporters, we're going to march up to the Capitol. Of course, he never marched up to the Capitol with them, but we all know what happened when they got to the Capitol and they broke in to the congressional building in that deadly rampage. So what Kamala Harris plans to do is to use that spot as the place to try and convey to people present here in Washington and also to voters all over the country that the country's at a crossroads, that Donald Trump is too dangerous, too extreme, too erratic, and too much of an enemy of democracy to be entrusted once again with the presidency. But she is also expected to focus on her own policy plans for 4 years in the White House. She's been under pressure, even from some supporters who say, don't make this all about the future of democracy. You've got to address the concerns that voters have about the economy, illegal immigration, a whole host of other issues. So I think it's going to be a slightly more wide-ranging speech than we were initially thinking we would hear. But what the campaign is going to do is use these images of her on the ellipse here in Washington, D.C., surrounded by tens of thousands of supporters. They'll use those images in the final, it'll be 6 days, won't it, of the election campaign as they roll out a whole host of fresh advertisements based off the back of this event.
And Simon, lastly, the polls have obviously changed with every day that's passed. The latest Reuters poll that I've seen shows that Harris's lead over Trump nationally has shrunk to just 1 percentage point. I'm just wondering what the pundits are saying about all of this.
Well, you're absolutely right. That poll published by Reuters today, conducted by Ipsos, says that Kamala Harris has a 44% rating nationally to 43% for Donald Trump among registered voters. And the poll is absolutely clear about what is top of mind for voters. 47% of voters favour Donald Trump's approach to the economy, to 37% for Kamala Harris. And that's one of the reasons why I think she's going to have to address that head on when she makes that speech later today. Her campaign chief strategist, Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, has said today to supporters and in television interviews that this election is competitive in every single one of the 7 battleground states. There is not a clear winner in any of those battleground states right now. She's describing it as a margin of error election. And that gives you an indication of the knife edge that, publicly at least, Democrat strategists say they are finding themselves confronting. They will be hoping that Kamala Harris does something in this rally tonight and in the next few days to try and eke out an advantage over Donald Trump. But all the signs are pointing to a very close election result and potentially a very long night on Tuesday of next week into Wednesday morning. No guarantee that by Wednesday morning here we're going to know the outcome of this election.
OK, Simon Marx in Washington, thank you very much indeed for bringing us all the latest. In other world news, Israel's parliament has voted to ban the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency from operating in Israel and occupied East Jerusalem, alleging its collusion with Hamas. Well, the legislation prohibits contact between UNRWA employees and Israeli officials within 3 months, thereby restricting aid operations in Gaza and the West Bank. Well, cooperation with the Israeli military is crucial for UNRWA's aid delivery, as it is the primary UN organisation in the region. Well, the US and the UK have raised serious concerns. The US State Department is urging Israel to reconsider that ban, calling UNRWA irreplaceable for humanitarian aid in Gaza. Well, the UNRWA Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, took to X to express his strong disapproval of the ban. He described the decision by Israel as a form of collective punishment, which he says will deprive over 650,000 girls and boys in Gaza from an education, putting an entire generation of children at risk. Well, the European Union has also condemned Israel's move to ban UNRWA from operating within Israel and East Jerusalem, as William Denslow now reports from Brussels.
The European Union has warned that the law could have far-reaching consequences that would seriously hamper the agency's ability to provide life-saving services to the people of Gaza. The statement shared on social media by the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell adds that the legislation stands in stark contrast to international law and the fundamental principle of humanity. The legislation means that within 3 months, contact between the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency workers and Israeli officials will be banned. The UN agency relies on coordination with the Israeli military to get aid into the Palestinian territories. It's estimated that nearly all of Gaza's population rely on services and aid provided by UNRWA. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says the law would have devastating consequences for Palestinian refugees. Israel has accused the agency of collaborating with Hamas, claiming that 19 of its workers played a role in the October 7th attacks. 9 people were subsequently fired following a UN investigation, and the agency denies any deeper involvement in the attacks. The European Union says it remains committed to supporting UNRWA and urges the Israeli authorities to reconsider its position. William Denslow, Arabiya News, Brussels.
Well, for reaction to this, I'm joined now by the UNRWA spokesperson, Jonathan Fowler. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I just want to ask you, first of all, what went through your mind when you heard that Israel is imposing this ban?
I mean, I think we had expected the legislation to pass. I mean, obviously, we and other parts of the United Nations system, and indeed the overwhelming majority in the international community had appealed for this not to happen. But what went through our minds was this is like another step in the attempt to dismantle the organisation, to hobble us, to prevent us from doing our work at a particularly critical time. So, I mean, a number of people in the office today, we were chatting about this amongst colleagues and reacting, and people were sort of, not surprised, fazed, and I mean, through my mind personally was, well, we have to keep on doing what we do, what we're mandated to do. There is no option on that, and this means that this kind of decision is absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, for people who don't know, just tell us a little bit more about the role that UNRWA plays.
Okay, so we were created as a specific UN organisation as a response to a very specific geographical crisis, which was the Palestine refugee crisis of the late 1940s as a result of the Arab-Israeli war. Now, our mandate has been repeatedly renewed ever since, every 3 years, and still valid now. And these are decisions of the international community through the voice of the UN General Assembly, the collective voice of the international community, to keep us working. And the reason we're still here after 75 years is because there's not been a diplomatic solution to one of the most protracted refugee crises in the world. So that's why we're still here. But we also exist separate to other things like the right to return, which was actually laid down in another UN resolution a year before we were even created. So if there's any sense that somehow sort of doing away with us, pushing us out of the picture, ends the refugee crisis, that's simply not the case.
And clearly this is going to have huge implications for the people of Gaza, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in normal times, as it were, I mean, our role, and we were unique in the UN system, is that we are a direct provider of services. So we provide education services, healthcare services, public sanitation, these kind of things for Palestine refugees in five areas. So that's Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. But in times of war times, and when we pivot into sort of humanitarian crises, we become more of a kind of classic humanitarian agency. We have an unparalleled network of staff in the Gaza Strip. We have 13,000 staff in the Gaza Strip, of whom around 5,000 are able to continue operating. We have a logistical platform which is unequaled. We are, and this has been said over and over, we are the backbone of the international humanitarian aid operation in the Gaza Strip. And if you remove the backbone from it, from the situation, from an aid operation, then we find ourselves completely unable as an international community to continue to function in the Gaza Strip. And that doesn't bear thinking about the consequences of that.
Yeah, obviously, there's lots of international concern about this decision by Israel. Some countries calling on Israel to reconsider. Is there any suggestion or any indication that Israel might do that?
It's very hard to say, a day after the vote. I mean, we've certainly observed the voices, the strong support before the vote from key voices in the international community, influential countries, voices from across the UN system, NGOs, before and in the wake of the vote, saying, that this cannot be allowed to happen because, this is much bigger. I mean, the focus is on what this will do to our operations in Gaza and the fact that we are part of the life support system for close to 2 million people who are facing famine, disease, all kinds of horrific challenges, and things are just not getting any better. And this is a man-made crisis, of course. Now, the risk is also that operations unravel in the West Bank, and with potential consequences there. So, there are voices from the international community saying this must not be allowed to happen. But overall, I mean, the issue here is that this goes against all international law. This goes against UN General Assembly resolutions. It goes against International Court of Justice rulings, a whole host of other things which are inscribed into how humanitarian organizations are supposed to be able to operate. And it's in a way, it's a unilateral blow or a sign of a unilateral blow against multilateralism. Now, the multilateral system is not perfect, but it's the best thing we have as a global community. The question then is, if this is allowed to continue, what influence does this have on other situations in other places in the world? And are we looking, is this a foretaste of the unraveling of the multilateral system? And that really is something that does not bode well for the future.
And just let's talk about what Israel has accused you of. Israel accusing Hamas employees of having had a hand in the 7th of October attack. I mean, just briefly, what's your response to that accusation?
I mean, as we've said repeatedly, I want to underline one thing, which is that we have repeatedly condemned the attacks of the 7th of October. They were abhorrent, and there should be no doubt about the fact that UNRWA has been incredibly vocal, as has the rest of the UN system, on what happened. These actions are entirely unacceptable. What I also want to say is that we, as an organisation, we know that we operate in a highly politicised context. We are an extremely scrutinised organisation, and we're the most scrutinised UN entity. We have what have been rated by independent reviewers as the most robust neutrality framework in the UN system and comparable international NGOs. This is a framework to ensure that people adhere to the values of what it is to be a UN civil servant. So private views are not policed, of course, but no actions involving armed groups, no kind of statements online which are are unacceptable, incitement to hatred. Whenever we've had cases in the past of things like this, we've always acted, we've investigated, and staff have been sanctioned. In this particular case, so at the end of January, when the allegations from the Israeli authorities first emerged that some of our staff had been involved in the 7th of October, we moved swiftly to suspend the staff in question. We mandated an independent investigation through the top UN investigative body, which is entirely independent of UNRWA, into the allegations. It took time. They needed to work to obtain evidence, which they did not obtain squarely from the Israeli authorities. But the ultimate conclusion was that of 19 staff who were subject to allegations, 9, the investigation concluded that they may, conditional, have been involved in some way, but it wasn't an evidence in sort of criminal law sense. As a result, we all upheld the termination of those staff's contracts. That's been done. We clean house when we need to. We understand the need to do this kind of thing. But sadly, and this is where the overall campaign, the attempts to dismantle UNRWA that I've referred to before, come into play. We see all kinds of outlandish accusations, including from senior Israeli officials, saying UNRWA is completely infiltrated by Hamas. But statistically, all kinds of statistics get thrown around. But if we talk about 9 people, we have 13,000 staff in Gaza. We have 30,000 staff working across the region. Overwhelming majority of our staff are Palestinians themselves. So the real story is here that in a highly politicized, highly sensitive context, people adhere to neutrality, and but yet we get tarnished by these accusations that somehow we're completely the opposite.
Okay. Jonathan, sorry to cut you short. We're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. But UNRWA spokesperson Jonathan Fowler, really appreciate you talking to us.
Thank you very much.
We're going to return to the US election now, and millions of Americans have already cast their votes ahead of next week's polling day. Well, recent polls, particularly in the swing states, show a close race between Donald Trump and his Democratic rival Kamala Harris. According to a national poll, Morning Consult's weekly survey, Harris leads Trump by 3 percentage points amongst likely voters, with 50% to Trump's 47%. That is down from a 4-point advantage last week. Well, considering the survey's margin of error of 1%, Harris's lead may range from 49 to 48%, or as wide as 51 to 46%. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by the chairman of the Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson. Great to have you with us again, Greg. Donald Trump is in Pennsylvania today. Just tell us why that is such an important campaign stop for him.
Yeah, it's really become the critical state amongst the 7 swing states. It's got 19 electoral votes, so it can really move the needle. There's very few paths for either candidate to win the election without winning Pennsylvania. It's possible, but challenging. So it's not surprising that both candidates are spending a lot of time there.
Yeah, reporters and analysts have been telling us that Donald Trump is going to be somewhat in damage repair mode there because, of course, Pennsylvania is home to an estimated 620,000 people of Latino origin.
Sure.
This, of course, following on from that joke made by Tony Hinchcliffe about Puerto Rico. Were you offended by that?
I'm not sure I was offended. I just thought it was stupid. And I thought it was, a mistake. And the fact that it became a distraction because there was so much great news about the Trump rally in New York, not exactly a hotbed of Republican thought. But, New York's a difficult place for Republicans, at least especially in Manhattan. And yet you had 100,000 people show up for this rally. For the most part, it was positive. There was a great energy. And ironically, very diverse, completely diverse compared to the stereotypes of Trump and Republican events. So, you had a lot of Hispanic and African American speakers. You had a lot of Israeli Americans there. You saw a lot of Stars of David and yarmulkes, and so, this was a great moment. And it was unfortunate that it was a distraction. And the specific joke, it wasn't about Puerto Rican people. It was a comment about the excess of landfill of rubbish being dropped in Puerto Rico. And it's the same thing in New York. It's Staten Island, for example, has been like a generational joke about how much more rubbish they have dumped in their areas. So, I think if anything, it should have pointed out or highlighted the fact that there's too much of it. It's unfortunate that it becomes the joke of comedians, but that's the risk of having a comedian at a political event. They often go a little too far, and perhaps he did. But I don't think it will hurt Trump significantly with Hispanics. He's polling 15 points better than compared to the last several elections, both with African Americans and Hispanics. So if Kamala Harris doesn't carry the Hispanic vote and the black vote at the same levels that Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and even Hillary Clinton carried, I don't see a lot of ways that she can win the election. This was not a good moment, but I don't think it's a major setback.
Greg, the president of the Republican Party in Puerto Rico, his name is Angel Citron, has said that unless Trump personally apologizes for that comment, he won't be voting for him. And that's coming from the head of the Republicans group there in Puerto Rico. Do you think Trump should apologize?
I mean, he already has apologized
directly,
publicly, in the campaign. But why wouldn't he? I mean, it's just an easy phone call, and I don't think that President Trump would have a problem with that. I think that, in fact, if anything, it's an opportunity to reach out to the voters in Puerto Rico. I mean, let's face it, Puerto Rico is not going to vote for President Trump, but it's a way to appeal to the people that might have been offended by this in the U.S. So I think it's a great move. I hope he does it.
One other thing I want to ask you about, Steve Bannon got out of prison today. I'm just wondering whether he's likely to play a role in the electoral race.
I think he will. He's obviously been a big supporter of Trump now for 8 or 10 years, and I think he's looked upon by the core, the base of the party favorably. Now, whether he'll be involved, we're a week away from Election Day, and he just got out of prison. But I do think it's a great moment. I think it brings attention to the fact that this lawfare, the weaponization of the justice system, wasn't just about Trump. It was about anybody affiliated with Trump. So I think it's good timing. I'm glad he's out, obviously. And I think if anything, like I said, if it calls attention to the weaponization that both President Trump and many of his colleagues and supporters have gone through, several have gone to jail. And good for him for getting out. He could have avoided this whole jail term if he had cooperated, but he didn't think that cooperating with that kind of a witch hunt was something he should do. So good for him for taking the sort of moral high ground on that.
Just lastly, Greg, a week today until the big day in the United States. Everyone goes to the polls. A lot of early voters already. Between 3% and 5% of Americans undecided. What would you like to see Donald Trump doing these next 6 days in order to capture some of that probably vitally important segment of the electorate?
Of course, and it's a great question. Believe it or not, 3% is what the number I'm seeing of undecideds. That's pretty low. That's a historical low. So I think it means this election will be more decided on turnout, on enthusiasm from the two parties. But of course, 3% can swing the election, given that it's statistically tied right now. You mentioned some polls. If you look at the aggregate of all the polls, Trump is now, as of today, leading by just under 1 point. He's leading by 0.9 of a point nationally. So that's a first for President Trump. And then in the swing states, he's leading collectively by 0.4 or just call it 0.5%. So, he's definitely in the driver's seat right now. And the most recent polls, the aggregators like Real Clear Politics, they use 2 weeks of polling data. But if you look at the last 4 days, 5 days, it's all Trump. So he just has to focus on the two big policies that Americans care about. One is inflation and the economy. Two is the border crisis. On both of those issues, he polls 10 to 15 points higher or ahead of Vice President Harris. So if I were him, my advice would be stick on those two issues. He wins on 9 out of 10 of the issues that, according to Gallup, are the most important to Americans. So he should just focus on that and avoid any sort of, avoid too much personal, constructive criticisms, but any kind of criticisms of her opponent. I think he's better when he talks about the issues and the outcomes.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Greg
Thank
Swenson,
you.
Chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Let's get a quick check of some other stories we're following for you now. The Russian President Vladimir Putin launches massive drills for the country's nuclear forces. Missiles were test-fired to mimic a large nuclear response to an enemy strike. While Russia's ground, sea and air assets were all part of that exercise. The German ambassador to Iran is recalled after Tehran executes a German-Iranian national. Germany is summoning Iran's top envoy and lodging a formal protest with the Iranian Foreign Ministry. Well, Berlin has also vowed serious consequences, with the top EU diplomat Josep Borrell saying that the European Union is considering its response as well. A $3 billion investment to improve America's port infrastructure. That is part of US President Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Well, this comes after a 3-day port strike earlier this month that stopped about half the country's ocean shipping. The Australian Premier has been accused of asking for free upgrades on Qantas flights. The claims against Anthony Albanese were made in a new book which alleged that the Prime Minister used his close relationship with the former CEO to benefit on personal flights, while Albanese maintains that he has, quote, acted in a transparent and appropriate way at all times. Let's get a check of some business news stories for you now. And BP's third quarter profit fell 30% to $2.3 billion. That's the lowest in nearly 4 years due to weaker refining margins and oil trading. This decline is linked to a slowdown in global economic activity and oil demand, especially in China. Well, the results increase pressure on the CEO, Murray Auchincloss, who aims to improve BP's performance amid investor concerns about its energy transition strategy. Belgium is constructing the world's first green energy island, starting with 23 large concrete boulders for a wind farm-powered energy hub. Well, the project's cost has increased from €2.2 billion to more than €7 billion, with initial elements set to be deployed at sea next year. Well, currently, just over 10% of Belgium's energy supply comes from renewables. JP Morgan Chase, the largest US bank, is suing customers for check fraud after a viral TikTok glitch allowed them to withdraw funds from deposited checks before they cleared. Well, the bank filed 4 lawsuits in Los Angeles, Houston, and Miami against 2 individuals and 2 businesses accused of illegally keeping $661,000 from forged checks. The banking giant HSBC's pre-tax profit in the third quarter rose 10% year on year. The bank cited revenue growth in 2 of its divisions, while the rise in pre-tax profit to $8.5 billion reflects a strong performance in the wealth management division, as well as higher revenues in global banking and markets. Well, last week, the bank announced a major shake-up under the new chief executive, George El-Hederi, who assumed his role in September. We've got some sports news for you now, and Ruben Amorim has declined to comment on his future at Sporting Lisbon, as Manchester United began talks about appointing him as their next permanent manager. Well, the 39-year-old is weighing the chance to success Erik ten Hag with United, open to negotiating his release fee of £8.3 million. Initial discussions have progressed significantly, including conversations about Amorim's coaching staff. Well, United is reportedly seeking a decision from Amorim by the weekend. And the world number 1, Yannick Sinner, has withdrawn from the Paris Masters due to a virus. Sinner's withdrawal means Carlos Alcaraz is now the highest-ranked player in the draw. He will face Nicolas Jarry in the second round. Last week, the 24-time Grand Slam champion Novak Djokovic also withdrew from the final ATP 1000 event of the year. And the Tour de France will finish at the Champs-Élysées in Paris once again next year. The race will feature an all-French route for the first time in 5 years, and its first finish at the Mont Ventoux since 2013. Well, the organisers say the race will return to the capital for the 50th anniversary of the very first arrival on the Champs-Élysées. And we got some breaking news from the Middle East. The Naim Qassem has taken over as the head of Hezbollah. Qassem was Hezbollah's deputy secretary under the Hassan Nasrallah. Well, following the news of this appointment, the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant says this would be, quote, temporary and not for long. Well, the Iran-backed group has been reeling from back-to-back losses of their leadership following relentless Israeli attacks since September. Well, Hashem Safieddine was slated to take over from Nasrallah before he too was assassinated in an Israeli operation earlier on this month. And we've got some news just coming into us here at Al Arabiya. The UN has written a letter to the Israeli Prime Minister with regard to that UNRWA ban we were just talking about a little earlier on. They're asking for them to reconsider that. News just into us. The UN has written to Israel asking for them to reconsider that ban on UNRWA, which provides vital aid across the Palestinian territories. And the US is urging Sudanese paramilitaries to halt their deadly assault immediately in the state of Al Jazeera. Sudan, of course, in a state of war for more than a year now. So the United States urging that war, that fighting comes to an end. Well, the United States also making clear its concerns and its opposition to Israel's bill. That news I was just talking about there, the UNRWA ban. Israel tabling, the United States tabling its opposition to that. We're just getting that from the State Department. This news just coming into us as we speak to you now. And the Israeli Chief of General Staff says, if Iran makes the mistake of launching another missile barrage at Israel, we will follow up once again. And we know how to reach Iran with capabilities we did not even use this time around. That's a reference to suggestions that Iran could be planning a counterattack to the attack that was carried out during the weekend by Israel on Iran. Let's get a quick reminder of our top stories here on Al Arabiya News. With just a week to go until Election Day, the former US President Donald Trump heads to key battleground state of Pennsylvania as Kamala Harris holds a rally in Washington, D.C. The Israeli parliament votes to ban the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency from operating in Israel and the occupied East Jerusalem, alleging its collusion with Hamas, and that's raising concerns about the delivery of aid to war-torn Gaza. And Hezbollah has named Naim Qassem as the group's new head. This after the killing of Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut last month. That is all we have time for. Coming up next is Hadley Gamble, and at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, do join us for Global News Today. That's a roundup of top international news with exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers. That's it from us. Stay tuned.
We go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
Bill Ford, welcome to Riyadh. Thank you so much for joining me on Al Arabiya. I want to kick off by asking you about your new ventures in the Middle East.
Well, first, Hadley, thank you for having me here. It's great to be back in Riyadh, here for the FII. But earlier this week, we announced the opening of our office here in Saudi Arabia. We've been active in the region for about 10 years, but now we'll have a team on the ground looking for investments throughout the whole GCC.
Tell me about what you see as the most exciting part about how Saudi Arabia is performing today.
Well, really building on the last 8 years of Vision 2030, there's been an entrepreneurial ecosystem that's begun to take hold. That's extremely exciting. And just a couple of quick notes. 5 years ago, Saudi venture capital was $150 million per year. Today, it's $1.4 billion per year. So the venture ecosystem has started. And something that's even more exciting is a lot of young Saudis who went abroad to be educated or maybe to work are coming back here to go into the private sector and either start companies or join early stage companies. So it is all the makings of a very exciting entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Usually there's this big narrative that people from the West come to Saudi Arabia, they're looking for investors, they're looking for cash, but you're putting business into this part of the world.
Yeah, it's a real shift. I mean, we've had some great investors from Saudi Arabia for the last 20 years and the GCC, and they've been an important part of our program. But what's really exciting now is that the amount of opportunities to invest in the GCC and in Saudi Arabia have increased significantly. And so this team on the ground is a full-fledged investment team. We incubated them in London, but now they're moving here and they look for investments in the region.
What do you say to the narrative in the West that Saudi Arabia is running out of time and running out of cash?
Well, they better get over here and visit and see the energy and the dynamism.
Yeah. But you're not worried by the borrowing?
No, I'm not really, because I think the private sector economy is growing 4% plus. I think that's going to carry the region. Yeah. And again, the sense of entrepreneurship and new company creation is so exciting right now.
Yeah.
I actually think they'll be fine.
Talk me through how you see the macro picture. If you were going to invest in anything right now, what would it be?
Well, one of the most exciting things going on here in Saudi is the whole fintech explosion.
Yeah.
They've always had some great financial institutions, but the amount of innovation in financial services is really on par with what we're seeing in other parts of the world. And that's really exciting. So I think fintech will be a major focus. The consumer markets, it's a very well-developed consumer market. B2C internet companies are really working here.
Yeah.
And so I think those two areas in particular will be exciting.
What are the things that you're worried about in the short to medium term? Are we talking about the presidential election? What's happening with China?
Well, the two big events here for the second half of 2024 have really been the interest rate cycle, which appears to have turned in most of the Western world and most parts of the world. That's good news. And the second is waiting on the U.S. election. I think once we clear those two major issues or major events, I think you'll see a lot more deal making happen, because again, people were on the sidelines to some extent waiting for those two things to happen.
If you were going to make a bet, would it be, the bombastic Trump or the verbally incontinent Kamala Harris? Who's going to win?
I don't know, but I do think, President Trump, if he does win, would be very good for business. Not just in the United States, but I think here in the Middle East. I think he's always had a pro-business agenda. He believes in the private sector, and I think those two factors will really, unleash a lot of energy that's been pent up for the last 4 years.
Yeah. Speaking of energy, the conversations that I've been having with energy ministers over the last year or so have been about AI and how much energy that's going to actually need, and that the world is not, in fact, prepared for that. What does it say to you that countries like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, are making such big investments in AI simply because they're going to be able to fund that energy need?
I think that the Middle East is incredibly well positioned to capitalize on what's going to happen in AI. It is two of the things that are absolutely essential to make AI work. One, as you said, Hadley, is power. Yeah. Well, the second is capital. This is, unlike the internet cycle, this is a very capital-intensive business to build AI. The data center needs, the compute power, the chips that are required, all that requires capital. So the GCC in Saudi, with those two assets on their side, again, are very well positioned to be a global player in AI.
Who do you think is going to be left behind?
I'm worried about Europe. I'm worried about the economic dynamism in Europe. I'm worried about their energy security. I'm worried about their level of government intervention into the private sector and what that means long term. And they're competing in a world where you have China, you've got regions like the Middle East that are forward looking and pro-business. You've got the U.S., which continues to plow ahead at 3% kind of growth rates with a lot of dynamism. And I think they're going to have to really get their act together if they want to compete.
Bill, it's wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya.
Thank you.
Jerry, great to meet you here at FII 8 this year. All right, so Arabiya Gate, it's a story that started maybe 6 years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong. Where are we at now? What's the percentage of the project that's completed? What are the new areas that you've opened up recently? Give us an update.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, and thank you always for your excellent coverage.
Thank you.
So, you know, Arabiya is critical as a giga project with the now commercial side, meaning the PIF-owned company. We've had very substantial progress because even though we're a 2030 giga project, we started opening assets in 2021. We opened up the UNESCO site and our very successful Bajeti district in 2022. 2023, we introduced our hotel practice, our museum practice. But would you believe, only in 2024, the progress we made, we now have 9 kilometers of parks finished. We have 6,000 of our 60,000 parking spots underground finished, generating revenue. We open next month in November our first of our 42 hotels, our Bob Salman Hotel, 134 rooms, Marriott Luxury Collection, walking distance from the UNESCO site. Our Wadi Sfar project, we already broke ground on Amman, Six Senses, Chedi, and then Fushan. But now also in our opening event on November 20th, we call it Bashir Arabiya, we will announce the groundbreaking for 12 additional hotels. This includes Ritz-Carlton, Baccarat, Corinthia. I mentioned Fushan, Armani, Rosewood, Raffles, The Address. So not only are we on time, we're on budget, and now with the 7,000 people here, a lot of buzz because they see Arabiya coming out of the ground. So it's no longer renderings, it's no longer concept. Now you see it.
Well, Jerry, you mentioned that some of your assets are already generating revenue. So
Correct.
Tell us a little bit of the licenses. Whom have you licensed to set up shop in Arabiya Gate? So other than hotels, what about the retailers and other companies?
Yeah, so Arabiya in Arabiya 1, which is historical Arabiya, it's meant to be the largest walkable, pedestrian-friendly city, but all with a high environmental impact and sustainability, right? Arabiya just won the largest global certification from LEED's Platinum for 4 kilometers. Never been given before. Arabiya just won 4th year in a row, best place to work. Arabiya just won a global award, 165 million construction man hours without a fatality. So we have a safe environment, very happy environment, 80% Saudi. Now on the licenses, all the major luxury hotel brands have signed up, 42 of them. But these hotels will be open prior to 2030. Now it's interesting because why only 1 or 2 hotels open now? Because what happened is to make Arabiya a walkable city, we had to put in 10 million cubic meters of infrastructure underground, including 60,000 parking spots for tour buses, taxis, Uber, deliveries, garbage, new fiber optics, water, electric. So we had to dig, if you will, a 45-meter hole, 10 kilometers on rock.
No easy task, eh?
No, we took out 700,000 loads of rock. So now everybody says, what did you do with all the rock, right? But to show you His Royal Highness's genius, when you drive King Khalid Road or drive the Western Ring Road to the airport, you'll see all this beautiful mustard stone with all plantings for Green Riyadh. That most of that comes from Arabiya. So we built the infrastructure, smart city technology, because you know the Crown Prince is very strict environmentally.
Very keen on that.
Very strict environmentally. So the fact that we are, all our concrete, all our cement, all our pavers on the ground now, net carbon zero, the technology to remove carbon from it. So I'm very honored because to have a great staff of 3,000 people 40,000 people on the job in the middle of Riyadh. But to be on time and on budget, so many people. But you know what we're seeing now? A big acceleration in foreign capital coming into the kingdom. But all the luxury brands, our licenses and retails, not only are they coming, all the luxury brands you know, but most of them are moving their regional headquarters to Diriyah. Now, Diriyah 2, which is a separate project, we will have 500 tech companies, 100 media companies, thank you very much, and 50 entertainment companies. So our brothers and sisters at the Royal Commission for Riyadh City have already signed 300 of those 500 companies, maybe more by now. So Diriyah 2 will be the Silicon Valley, the tech. It'll bring a lot of young people. We're building 30,000 apartments and homes and villas because Diriyah will have an ecosystem now by 2030 for 100,000 people.
Well, waiting on to hear more good progress on Diriyah 2 in the coming few years. Thank you very much, Jerry.
Thank you. Very nice to see you.
Same
Only
here.
one Diriyah.
Only one Diriyah.
Only one Diriyah. Thank you.
Absolutely. Mr. Paul Hudson, the CEO of Sanofi, thank you very much for joining us here at the FII. Please tell us, when you look at the Saudi market, it's a growing population, it's the biggest economy in the region. When you're viewing this market, what sort of investment opportunities do you find here?
Well, this is quite an incredible market, in fact. The speed that it's evolving and the long-term planning that they're putting in place, particularly in health through 2030. You have to imagine when we're making long-term investment decisions, we want some predictability of commitment to something much higher, like a purpose around delivering better healthcare. Here, it is absolutely front and center. People are smart, the capital is there, the people are motivated, so it's an easy choice for us in the end.
Mr. Hudson, how will Sanofi, or how can Sanofi support the Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, which aims to diversify its economy? It has specific targets when it comes to several sectors. So how can your company support those goals?
Well, we know that healthcare and education are absolutely critical to vibrant economies. We'll play a little role in healthcare. We've found a very open government that wants to access innovation, not only in terms of manufacturing and research and development, but also getting access to innovation for patients, people with chronic diseases who need the very latest medicines. There's a willingness to do that. We'll play a big part. We are going to be the world's leading immunology company. We're one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. We're excited to bring all of our new launches here to Saudi Arabia.
You've had an announcement just last week with the NOPCO. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the first of one or two, I hope, but this was to build insulin manufacturing here, and we'll make more than 14 million insulin pens right here in Saudi Arabia over the next few years. So that provides supply resiliency, expertise, knowledge, tech transfer. So it's really about upskilling and also us putting firm roots, deep roots into the country.
This comes probably as a part of Saudi Arabia's endeavors to localize content, to create local content, do transfer of knowledge.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about the timelines? How can you support with those goals through this project and maybe others?
Well, these things, we have to raise them from the ground, but there is, I've learned one thing as I've been here the last few days. There is, a long history of doing things with discipline and continuity, and we'll bring that factory up and we'll make sure that it's here for the long term to help patients with diabetes. We're also working on other projects around vaccines to try and do something very similar. And if we can get to a good place with the government on that, we may be able to do even more. So bring our expertise, help people understand and educate them locally with it, build the capability locally, bring the access to that innovation to people in this great country. It's just the beginning, really, for us.
So this is your first FII, FII 8. Will we see you next year then?
Well, I didn't know what to expect. It's not only my first FII, it's my first trip to Saudi Arabia. And for me, it's been eye-opening. You know what you read, you know what you see, you know what you hear. But when you're on the ground, I've found that people have been incredibly welcoming, very constructive, very energizing. I've met so many people just before and after a session we just had that continued relationships, people I know from the global economic community, healthcare. This is a cool event. We'll see. It's the first day. We'll know a bit more tomorrow.
Well, we hope to see you more often in Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much for this interview, Mr. Hudson.
Well, thank you to both of you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
I'm extremely happy, and I decided to be selfish today. This is why I asked my team that this conversation I want to moderate, because Shoshu is one of my heroes, even if my family is making a lot of fun of me for years and years, because I was one of the first users of TikTok.
Thank you.
And despite many people challenging me about why, before going to bed, I spend almost, so I'm sharing some secrets with you guys, half an hour every day on TikTok. I find that it's an amazing platform, what you have created, despite all the critics and the challenges you are going through, but it's not the purpose today. But I want to share with our, and in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, almost everyone is looking at TikTok, I can tell you. Huh? If they say no, they are lying, because I know that many people are forwarding me a lot of TikTok stuff. So, yes or no, guys? Be honest. You see. So, Sho is the Chief Executive Officer of TikTok, and of course, he is leading the overall business and bringing the company's vision to life. So, just for you to understand who is Sho, he has been part of the TikTok family since its inception. He was born and raised in Singapore, and he attended the university in London. So he holds an undergrad degree from University College London, UCL, and an MBA from Harvard Business School. So he's a smart guy, and this is why one day he probably had this great idea of having this original spark that ignites the idea for TikTok. So what was exactly this original spark, Sho?
Yeah, it's Richard. I think it's we have to start from the mission of the business, and it's important because ultimately, we have thousands of employees, and every day they're building towards something. The mission that we have is inspire creativity and bring joy. So that's sort of and I'll come back to this in a second, because if you use TikTok, it sounds like you do every night for 30 minutes. You could spend more time if you want. What you will find is a very creative experience. It's a very joyful experience. In terms of the original spark, the idea was to present content to users, not based on who you followed. Because, back in 2012, 2013, the social network was all in the rage. And it's all about building your social graph, meaning, getting people to follow you, building out that graph. And the content that you will see is going to be based on people that you follow. And I think that's the model that many of our peers in the market still follow today. But we have brought something very new to the table. We recommend content to you not based on how many people follow you, but based on interest signals. Meaning if you have a good message, if you have a funny video, if you are a small hippo in Thailand, which has gone completely viral, called Mudang. If you haven't seen it, just search it.
Yeah.
If you have a good message, you don't need any followers to begin with to become viral, to make sure that your message is heard by as many people around the world as possible. And I think that's the difference. That's the key difference that we bring to the table.
But what was the main decision you made to turn almost what was a small app to what is becoming now almost a cultural phenomenon?
There are a couple of things that, as in the last 10 years, first of all, machine learning and AI enable the recommendation algorithm to be as useful and as interesting as it is today. It's very accurate if you think about it. There's no human curation really that goes into the recommendation process. It is really about using machine learning and then matching your signal interest with potential signal interest that you could have. And that's really sort of the magic of the algorithm. Now, beyond that, in the last 10 years, everybody has a smartphone now. And smartphones have cameras. So we decided that the app was not only going to be based on text, it's not only going to be based on pictures, but we opened up video. And we made video the main format for the app itself. And that's another innovation that we brought to the table. And the third is, of course, this idea that everybody should have the chance to publish. So it shouldn't just be in the hands of, a small group of people. We allow essentially anyone with a camera, anyone with creativity to be able to create something very quickly using all the tools that we give them and be able to share their message with the world. So that's really the difference that we brought.
I know you are under huge pressure and some critics, so let's make a pitch to our friends and to the millions of people who are watching us. How TikTok could be a force for good?
Yeah, I think a lot of people still have this understanding, especially people who don't use the app that much. They think that the app is, for young people, is dancing, is singing. Well, that's all true. There's still a lot of dancing and singing. But it's more than that now, because we have more than 1 billion users around the world today. In many countries...
How many as of today, do you know?
We don't disclose the specifics, but it's definitely significantly larger than 1 billion active users around the world. And if you think about, the content that we have even in this country, I was looking at the feed. Whenever I travel, I look at the feed. And it's my third time in
the kingdom,
in just this year. There is somebody called Abdullah El-Alawi, for example.
Abdullah El-Alawi.
El-Alawi.
Okay.
He's a local creator. He shares a lot of content about local culture. For example, I learned that I'm going to say this wrong, the Schwab. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he talked about the history of the Schwab, the fishing net, and the years of the wheat, and how that original practical use is married into the culture today in the local context. It's amazing. I mean, I did not know about this. I think there is a female footballer called Farah. She plays for Etihad, I believe. Mm-hmm. She's on the platform and she's encouraging young women to learn about the sport, to pick up the sport. So it's no longer just about entertainment, the light dancing and singing, which is still important. It is now about community. It is about education. It's about heritage. It's about culture. It's about the arts. And I think that's a significant positive change to the world.
So let's continue the pitch. How TikTok could make us more creative and not just be distracted and become addicted to an app which is, forgive me to be a bit provocative, useless, So how can it help us to be more creative? No, because I will be very honest, I find great ideas, as a creator of also platforms. I took 2-3 ideas from what I found on TikTok. So if I'm asking the question, because I am convinced of the answer, but I would like you to continue this speech on how can we be more creative, or how can you help us to be more creative?
We provide tools. Well, first of all, to inspire creativity is the mission itself. We talked about the mission at the start. Inspire creativity, bring joy. So creativity and joy. And joy is important. We'll talk about joy in a second.
This is your DNA. The DNA is creativity and joy.
Exactly. It's built in the mission statement of the company. So what we provide is, if you open the app, you click the plus sign at the bottom, you go to effects, you're going to see thousands and thousands of effects that we bring to the table to help spark people's creativity. It's a tool that enables them to express themselves better. In terms of the content pool itself, what we are seeing is that things like Book Talk. Book Talk is a very organic movement on the platform where people talk about books that they like. It has tens of billions of views around the world today. There is something very interesting that we launched in the US about a year ago called the STEM feed. So this is if you go to settings, content preferences, turn on STEM feed, you will see a feed where it's only science and math content. And we are going to launch this in the kingdom as well, in conjunction with the Science and Technology University here as well. So we believe that this should be a platform that's not only about creativity and fun, but you could learn something as well. And we're going to take all the STEM and math content that we can find, and we're going to put it in this dedicated and specialized feed for our users in this country.
So what do you think is, we spoke about the DNA, but what do you think is your responsibility or the responsibility of TikTok vis-a-vis humanity? Let's be ambitious. We tried the FI Institute to have an impact on humanity. We spoke a lot here during the past few hours about how to invest for good, how to invest for purpose. So I think as a founder, you wake up in the morning and I think you should ask yourself, what is my legacy? What I'm doing good for humanity? So what is the responsibility of TikTok?
We think that the legacy is going to be defined by the mission. The mission, creativity and joy. And it is important. We talked a lot about the creative components. We can translate this into economic activity. So today in just the kingdom, We have 125,000 businesses that use our platform. And because, we talked about this earlier as well, you do not need to be famous. You don't need to have followers. If you have a good message, you're going to get an audience on TikTok. And that's the difference that we bring. So businesses with good products and a good message can find it very easy to get access to a large audience on our platform, which is why they embrace it so much. Most of them don't pay us, by the way. They just post content on our platform. It's interesting content. They get the audience that they want. So on an economic point of front, I think we are contributing to the local economies that we are in as well. And in terms of joy, there's one other thing that people don't talk about, but we are very proud of it, which is for a very long time, people assume that the only way you get viral is to say something controversial, outrageous, angry, toxic, you name it, provocative, you name it. But if you look at just two angles, if you look at the top 10 videos of TikTok every single year, we publish them, we're going to publish them again very soon. They're all joyful, every single one of them. Last year, there was a cat that looked like a dog. There was a dog that sounded like a cat. This is really very joyful types of content. And the number one creator on our platform, his name is Kabi. Kabi is a comedian. He is famous for just being entertaining. He's very creative, the way he's entertaining. I'm not sure if you've seen his videos. He does his face.
Yeah, I saw. But
Kabi was unknown before TikTok. So unlike many other platforms, he wasn't famous before. He wasn't like a famous politician. He wasn't a famous soccer player. He wasn't a famous celebrity. He was a factory worker in Italy. He had talent, and he became the number one creator with 160 million followers on our platform. I think the joyful and the creative and the discovery element of this will define the legacy of our company.
Let's talk now about TikTok's role in journalism, if any role exists. I'm a strong believer on the traditional media, and we are doing whatever we can here to support the traditional media. This is why next door you have our media square, where we have all the traditional media, and a lot of respect for them because they have the power to share the knowledge, to share information, to give access to knowledge to many people. But with news and information moving to social media, do you think that traditional news source like TV, print, become obsolete?
I don't think so. I have a lot of respect for what you call traditional media. I think there's a lot of value in editorial standards, in robust, journalism, and I think this is an industry that we want to be. We want to help them. We want to help them reach a bigger audience as well. So our platform is open to many news media outlets and many publishers, and a lot of them embrace our platform, and they have found much larger audiences that they could have in a more traditional sense. Just print and digital. On TikTok, some of them have tens of millions of followers, and they're able to bring their robust news to an even greater audience. And it's something we have been working closely with the industry to power. In the kingdom, we're working with SRMG Academy, for example, to help onboard more journalists, especially tech journalists, to better understand how to use TikTok to get a bigger audience. So I see us living in a very sort of symbiotic, relationship, rather than one of replacement.
At the FI Institute, we publish every year the FI Priority Compass, which is a big survey asking to many people in the world, thousands and thousands of people, what is your first priority? To make a long story short, this year, 2024, for the third consecutive year, priority number 1, cost of living. Priority number 2, something new, governance. Mm-hmm. And number 3, healthcare. Back to governance, we were asking more questions, and just to share with our friends and members, and these results are on our app now, we released the report this morning, 75% of the people in the world consider that the world is not going in the right direction, and 66% consider that their own country is not going in the right direction, except, and trust me, totally objectivity, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, by the way. But the big majority consider that the country is not going in the right direction. Do you think that TikTok is eroding public trust also in government and institutions? Because they always pick this information through social media. Social media are very influential, as you know. And this is how the public opinion is building its own opinion. So do you think TikTok is eroding this trust or highlighting this trust?
I think we bring a voice to many people. I think we bring creativity, we bring joy. We're also aligned that dangerous misinformation has no place on our platform. So the way we govern our governance on our
this
platform,
was my question. How do you
we have
control?
We have a set of rules that we call our community guidelines, and these guidelines are available on the on our website. So if you go, it's there. It's about 30 pages long today. We change it, and update it every now and again with refresh guidelines. In the guidelines, you will find things that we allow or disallow on the platform. And, there are various rules here. There's, sort of things that we absolutely do not allow, like dangerous misinformation, like violence. We take it off the platform. And then there are other things that we do not allow for our younger users. So if you are below a certain age, our content is actually more restricted for you. We have a more restricted experience. We don't allow you to use a few other features on our platform, like no direct messages by default if you're below 16, no live streaming if you're below 18. We put some restrictions on how much time you can spend on the platform if you're below 18. And we give parents a lot of tools to control the experience of their teenagers on our app. Because, I have 3 children myself. I understand that parents need tools to be able to, on the one hand, you want your children to be part of the digital world because that's the world that we live in. On the other, I think we all need more tools to be able to have conversations to build a healthy relationship between our children and their digital devices and apps that they use. So I think we're very aligned on many of these things. But generally speaking, the fact that this platform exists and it gives the normal person a voice, the small business, the soccer player, someone like Abdullah Alawi, a voice to share about their heritage, their culture, their history, and their perspective on the world. I think that's actually a net positive. We just have to make sure that our community guidelines are well enforced.
2 short last questions. First one, which advice would you give to the young entrepreneurs in Saudi Arabia, in the region, if they want one day to create something equivalent to TikTok, or, how you start? Here there is, in the DNA, an entrepreneurship mindset. So what are the 2 advices that you will give to the young entrepreneurs?
Yeah, my experience of talking to younger entrepreneurs is typically I learn more from them than I find that I can say, because the times are changing. And, a lot of times as companies get bigger, we spend too much of our times in the internal building and the mechanisms. And sometimes, meeting young entrepreneurs and, they're so close to their
refreshing.
Users. They're so close to their product. It's so refreshing. If I maybe were to say one thing, it would be to continue to do that. Get first-hand information. Don't rely on, your managers to write reports for you. Go speak to your users. Don't rely on reading reports on how AI works. Just go download the app and try it. Just try it yourself. Don't lose that. Because I think as businesses grow, we tend to lose that.
Sure. At the FII, as you know, we look forward, and the closing session in a couple of days will be about the world in 2030. How do we see it? And even maybe 2050, which is literally tomorrow. So what do you think are the opportunities and the challenges for TikTok by 2030 and then by 2050?
I think it's going to be around 3-4 things. The first is trust. I think our industry is undergoing a period where, our industry as in, social media broadly, is undergoing a period where people have questions. Is it, how are you thinking about this? How are you thinking about that? In the countries that we operate in, we are very global platforms in the sense that our users are all around the world. But in every country that we operate, the experience is deeply local. So I think earning trust locally, earning trust, just generally as an industry, is going to be a big challenge for us, all of us. And trust earning is not about, being able to market yourself very well, although that helps. Ultimately, it's going to be based on the things that you have done. Did you fundamentally go address people's concerns?
And AI?
Yeah. That will be the technology part, which will be my third part. I think embracing technology and making sure that, this is clearly is moving at a very fast speed. So we need to stay on top of it and understand the impact it's going to have on our business. And that in itself is challenging. And then, of course, it is making sure that we continue to hear what our users want. We built e-commerce, the e-commerce experience, because our users wanted it. They saw something they liked. They said, can I just click and, transact? Why can't I do that? So it was in response to what they told us that we built that. And it's important to continue to do that. That will be the second thing. And finally, it's just, keeping the organization fresh, young talent, people coming in, bright ideas, and good ideas, making sure that they can be heard and they don't get lost.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Shoshu, the man behind TikTok. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start with what is interesting to you. I know it's AI. I know you are, and the quote is, I am obsessed by realizing artificial superintelligence. Are you still obsessed?
Definitely. I'm only focused on that.
What does that mean? You're only focused on that. Explain.
Well, that would change the mankind's future forever. I want to make mankind's future better, happier, fantastic future. That's what I'm interested in.
So what is the difference between AGI and ASI? To those of us born of a different generation.
Okay.
What's the difference?
Yeah, AGI definition is same level as a human brain. That's AGI, artificial general intelligence. But people have a different point of view definition of artificial superintelligence. How super? 10 times super or 100 times super? My definition of ASI is 10,000 times super, smarter than human brain. That's my definition of ASI, and that's coming in 2035. 10 years from today. 10,000 times smarter. That's my prediction.
What is different in that? What will it do that we should either look forward to or be worried about?
Both. We should be looking forward to that. Of course, we have to also be careful. We have to regulate. If such a superpower comes and no regulation, it could be super dangerous. Of course, automotive industry was very, very beneficial, productive to human, but we have a regulation. Same thing.
No, I don't. With respect, because we don't have anybody in the world who's willingly building or wanting to build automobiles that are dangerous. When it comes to AI, there may be state actors, there may be independent actors that want to build AI that can be harmful to other people. How can we guard against it? How do you guard against it?
Of course, there is always some bad guy. 1%, 2% of human are bad guys. Okay? But 99% of human are actually good guys. Okay? So the bad guy, of course, try to use AI for the bad intention. However, those bad guys not necessarily have enough capital. This is a massive capital. Hundreds of billions of dollars of investment is required to make super intelligence. The bad guy, how do they sponsor? There is not enough money to sponsor the bad guys.
You admitted in the past that you were not as involved in AGI, frankly, because you didn't have the money. You ran out of money.
Yes. Of course, money is not unlimited. I had to save some money for the big fight, okay? For the big opportunity. Now I'm saving, tens of billions of dollars so that I can make next big move.
Do you know where that is? I mean, you may not know the companies, they may not even have been started yet, but do you have a very strong compass for the direction?
Yes.
Tell us.
I cannot.
That's what we're all here for.
No. I have my own view.
Go on.
Okay? No. ARM is our core company. Okay? ARM has 99%, or should I say honestly, almost 100% of market share of all the mobile phone chip. 90% of any high-end AI, IoT chip, and all kinds of other chips. So ARM is going to become an AI-centric chip company very soon. So that's one thing, okay? But there are robotics that I'm super interested in, these AI robotics, not the traditional robotics. The artificial superintelligence comes and robotics come together. That will be a tremendous, product.
The fascinating thing about you is you have been there, you've done it, you've had the great success, you've had the follow-on failures, and you're doing it again.
No, in between, I had many mistakes, like WeWork and,
Does it annoy you? Does it annoy you when people focus on WeWork, which was financially big but relatively insignificant in the great scheme of your finances? And yet everybody says, oh, Massa, WeWork, oh, Alibaba, it was lucky. Does it annoy you?
Well, people should have their own freedom of thinking. I learn more and more by my mistake, and I almost went bankrupt twice, right after the net bubble burst, right during the Lehman crisis. I survived. I actually lost 99% of our company's value, but somehow I came back.
Did you lose that value because you took on too much risk, or was it foolish? Or bad luck?
I don't think, I made that foolish mistake in the big sense. Net bubble crashed because people's view on the value of internet company exceeded while the true value was still on this process. But at the end, internet was not the bubble. Year 2000 was not bubble. After that, it's much bigger. So my general direction, I don't regret.
Now, this is really important when we talk about AI, because if you take, for example, NVIDIA, the number of people who will say, oh, NVIDIA's in trouble, oh, NVIDIA's got problems, blah, 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 blah. Oh, AI, really all that's happened is that the market has overvalued too soon.
That's a good question. That's a good question. Many people will still doubt, okay? So I think NVIDIA is undervalued.
What?
Undervalued.
On what basis?
Because the future is much bigger.
But the market's concentrating, as we heard in a panel earlier. It's quarterly reports. It's, if NVIDIA tells us that it's going to be longer and slower, we all get...
Yeah. NVIDIA is just one example.
Right.
Okay? What about the total, Gen AI future? What is the value of the future? Is this a bubble today or not? Okay? Some critics, the most negative guy says, this AGI, ASI, in 10 years, maybe only 5% is actually useful or, replacing people's job, but 95% still the same, no change. It takes time. So I say, okay, let's accept the most negative critics' view. That is only 5% change, 95% unchanged. But what is that, ASI investment required to take? Okay, 10,000 smarter than mankind. How many gigawatts? We were talking about gigawatts just before me.
Yeah.
I have predicted it will take 400 gigawatts of AI data centers power. 400 gigawatts. That's bigger than total US electricity. And it will require 200 million chip. Okay? The cumulative capex, $9 trillion. $9 trillion. How do you recoup? How do you recoup? It's too much investment for many people's view. I say it's still very reasonable capex. $9 trillion is not too big. Maybe too small.
You like to think big.
Yeah. So let me say, what is $9 trillion cumulative? But if the 5% of GDP in 10 years from today replaced by ASI, what is the number?
Right.
5% of global GDP is $9 trillion. $9 trillion per year. If the ASI produce you $9 trillion per year, cumulative investment of $9 trillion, small money.
All right.
Small money. You recoup in 1 year for the total cumulative. So that means $9 trillion capex investment you can depreciate. 1 year revenue, that means like 50% profit. 50% profit. It is going to be $4 trillion net income per year. $4 trillion net income shared by new GAFA. 4 companies will take $1 trillion profit.
And you want to be one of them?
Of course.
Right. Before we finish, I just want to ask, let's ask our AI friend here. The question I posed to our AI friend is Masa-son a guru when it comes to investing? I asked this question. Can we have the answer, please?
Masayoshi Son is definitely recognized as a guru of investment. His early $20 million investment in Alibaba grew to $75 billion by 2014, contributing significantly to SoftBank's success. However, for some other investments, there have been mixed results.
Thank you. Quiet, I've got a minute left. I want to ask you, after both difficult times, you went into a period of reflection and contemplation. You disappeared. You thought. You went up a mountain, whatever. What did you learn about yourself?
Well, I say it's a good experience. Good experience that I get defeated, I get laughed, I get criticized. That make me think harder. That make me think I have to be stronger. And that's all good. I learn more. I think more. And before I go sleep, I have lots of concern. When I wake up with a big smile.
Ladies and gentlemen, Masa, thank you very much.
Seoul. We give you a tour to the soul of South Korea's Seoul City. It's the destination that offers tourists endless shopping and dining experiences, a dose of fun and entertainment, its ages-old traditions, history, and unique culture. For the first timer, Get a quick introduction through the city via the Seoul City Bus Tour. It's the top recommended way to see Seoul on your first day. It will speed through Seoul's top city highlights, which you can view during the day or in the evening. It's time to visit the arts and festival scene of South Korea. Of course, Korea is popular for its history and tradition, but Seoul has just a lot of modern, international, and contemporary events to offer. There's always a regular listing of festivals and performances in the city, as well as exhibits on display at the art museums. Done sightseeing? Time for shopping. Seoul is in fact known for all the shopping, cultural events aside. The Koreans actually refer to window shopping as eye shopping. The top places to visit are Insadong, Apgujeong, Myeongdong, Dongdaemun, and Itaewon. Fan of Korean dramas and K-pop? Well, Seoul is definitely the place for that. Seoul is the popular capital of Hallyu, or the Korean wave in pop culture. And the city is teeming with items to adorn your K-pop fandom with. Then there are the Korean traditional markets. BB creams and bibimbap aside, this is the place to experience the traditional Korea. This is where you can buy traditional products such as the hanbok, ginseng, or electronics. Practically everything is sold there. There are also food stalls that offer Korean food, such as blood sausage, bindae-tteok, or deep-fried Korean pancakes, kimbap, maekyeoli, among others. Also a must-visit is the Namsan Seoul Tower. It's an iconic landmark that offers the best spot to see the entire Seoul. It has a warm, luminescent glow at night. The tower also has a revolving restaurant, which is a popular place to dine for touring couples. Namsan Seoul Tower is also where couples will find the famous locks of love and can leave their own too.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday right here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, coming up on the programme. A week before Election Day, across all 7 battleground states, the candidates are within just 2 points of each other, making each state a toss-up. The former President Donald Trump heads to Allentown, Pennsylvania. That's a key battleground state, as he brushes off critics, including the former First Lady Michelle Obama. Kamala Harris rallies in Washington in what her team is calling the former prosecutor's closing argument. And Israel's parliament votes to ban the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency from operating in Israel and occupied East Jerusalem, alleging its collusion with Hamas. Hello and welcome. The US Vice President Kamala Harris is set to address a crowd of 20,000 people in Washington tonight. Her team is framing this as the former prosecutor's closing argument, where she will speak at the Ellipse, which is just outside the White House, an area that previously hosted Donald Trump's rally on the 6th of January 2021, shortly before the attack on the US Capitol. Meanwhile, Tim Walz, Harris's running mate, will campaign in Georgia. That is a crucial swing state where Trump has been actively rallying his supporters. Well, Trump spoke from his home in Mar-a-Lago in Florida before heading to Allentown, Pennsylvania today. Pennsylvania, of course, a key battleground state where both he and Harris have made several recent visits. Well, given the significant Puerto Rican population in Pennsylvania and the racist remark made at Trump's rally regarding the U.S. territory, these campaign stops could prove critical to his efforts in the state, where he currently holds a narrow lead, according to poll trackers. Well, I'm joined now by the Republican strategist and former chairman of the Nevada State Republican Party, Amy Tarkanian. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Al Arabiya News, Amy. I just want to start by asking you about your own story, because back in 2016, you were a delegate for Donald Trump. I gather you voted for him in 2020, but this time you're not going to support him. Why the change of heart?
That is correct. And I actually learned the hard way. I actually chose a couple of other possible candidates in 2016 before I fell in line and became a delegate for Donald Trump. So he wasn't ever my first choice, but I did feel that he was better than the Democrat opponent. And so we continued down that road leading into 2020. I thought he was doing a fairly decent job at turning the economy around and leading the nation and where it needed to head. And towards the end of his time in office, it became extremely disappointing and concerning because he continued to surround himself with grifters, with people who were now in trouble with the justice system, and he was continuing to put misinformation, and quite honestly, that's an accident, but disinformation is intentional. So he was also now starting to peddle disinformation leading up to the possibility of him losing the election. And so instead of having any self-reflection, he pointed the blame on everyone else and everything else. And that led his base to believe that there was systemic fraud, which I think really harmed our election system tremendously. And not only that, but the final straw for me was the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, where he sat idly by for several hours and allowed people to continue to create chaos. Some were peaceful, that is correct, but there were many that were not. And there were some that were injured, many that were hurt, and are still now having to deal with the repercussions and are in prison because they believed every word that he said about storming the Capitol and that he would be by their side. So I think his rhetoric is quite dangerous, and I've had enough.
Do you think your case is unusual, or do you think there are a lot of people like you who perhaps voted for Trump in the past but won't vote for him ever again?
I do believe that there is a voting segment that feel the same that I do. Are they quite as vocal? No. I think that you have a number of people, especially when President Biden was still the presumptive nominee, and they were deemed what we now call double haters. And I still fit that bill. I'm not happy with either the Democrat or Republican options at the top of the ticket. And so that's why you also see in my home state of Nevada an increase in the party registrations of nonpartisan and independents. It's skyrocketed, in fact. And then in second place would be Democrat and in third, Republican.
Back in July, you're quoted as having described the electoral campaign as the script from a scary movie. And I'm just wondering, in the 3 months that have passed since you made that comment, whether you think the script has got a whole lot scarier?
I do. And it's interesting because you see polling across the nation, and of course you can take polling seriously, or you can take polling with a grain of salt because it's just a snapshot. And quite honestly, I have seen time and time again polls fail miserably. But it does seem that no matter the polling company, they do have this election in a nail biter. It's neck and neck. And I think it's because, thankfully for Donald Trump's sake, he is now running against Kamala Harris, who is viewed as somebody who is extremely weak and a puppet and doesn't really have her research down on the issues as well as she should. And then you've got now Donald Trump, who unfortunately yesterday, I think, displayed something disgusting and terrible, where he had a number of speakers for several hours leading up to his speech at a rally in New York with disgusting, which were supposed to be jokes, but they weren't funny. This wasn't an award ceremony. It's not a roasting ceremony. It's not a fundraiser. This is where you're supposed to be serious and talk about where you're going to take the nation and talk about issues. But yet they chose to, basically use bigotry, hate, vileness, and continue to attack Vice President Harris on, her ethnicity. It was quite disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting listening to some of what was said yesterday, because from a purely strategic point of view, and this is your area of expertise, I mean, it's quite risky making jokes or poking fun at quite large segments of the electoral population. I mean, he was making jokes about, obviously alluding to that comment from a former staffer who said he had fascist tendencies, and then he made a joke about these German generals and how he wished he'd had a few of them. I mean, that's going to horrify some elements of the electorate, isn't it? And could cost him quite dearly. I mean, do you think that's an act of self-harm?
I do, and I also think it's an act of arrogance. I think it was very sloppy, and I don't think it was smart strategically at all. Of course, it's great to be able to sit there and to crack jokes about certain scenarios, but this is not stand-up comedy hour. This is not a time where you're supposed to be poking fun at a certain segment of people or situations that are unfortunate. And that's exactly what they did. It was poor taste and timing, and I think it will end up hurting him to some degree. He's going to be heading now towards Pennsylvania, and rightfully so. Hopefully he's able to clean up some of the mess that was made, because there is a very large Puerto Rican voting base there. And currently, right now, I'm in the state of Florida, which also has a very large Puerto Rican voting base. And that was one of the distasteful, disgusting jokes that was made on that stage, basically saying that Puerto Rico was an island, of garbage. And so that's not funny. It might work in a small, comedy room somewhere else. But this is a very large, this is not just national, it's international stage. And people are watching and they're listening and they're wanting to know, where are you going to take us? How are you going to help me and my family? And that was not helpful.
Yeah, I mean, Pennsylvania has a really important and growing Latino electorate, voter population. I mean, I read that the numbers of people of Latino heritage in Pennsylvania have tripled since the year 2000. We're now talking about 620,000 people in Pennsylvania who have Latino heritage. I mean, such an important state like Pennsylvania. I mean, 620,000 people upset, offended, maybe not all of them, but some of them. I mean, that's the sort of thing that could actually switch the state altogether, isn't it? I mean, that could really end up costing him the state of Pennsylvania.
Sure, 100%, because I honestly do believe that you do have a number of people out there, such as I described, that are double haters or people that are undecided still. And that very well could have been the final straw. That could have been, maybe they were teetering and now it's time to go into the ballot box and they're just simply going to flip that switch last second. There are voters like that. So, once again, it was not wise. I think this was terrible. And the fact that you also had leaders from states such as Florida, Pennsylvania, that were quick in response to these negative words being spoken, took to social media and basically, said this is not acceptable. This is not a reflection of who we are. I do not agree with these comments. And but where was Donald Trump? he didn't respond right away. He didn't even respond when he took to the stage. He just let things continue to flow in the way that it did, unfortunately. And then once the comments went viral, then they issued a statement.
Yeah, he issued a statement, but it wasn't a personal apology, was it?
Correct.
So those Tony Hinchcliffe comments, I mean, have caused a massive furor. And in fact, we've talked about this today and yesterday here at Al Arabiya News quite extensively. And I'm just wondering, are there any signs this is dying down?
Are they dying down?
No, is the furor dying down?
No, I think it's ramping up. I think the fact that yesterday, I didn't catch the entire rally the night prior. I woke up yesterday to, clips of it and was mortified. And I had a number of people call me actually mortified as well. And so, I think the conversation's still going on, 2 days later, and we're waiting now to see, is Donald Trump going to apologize today in his press conference that he's supposed to be holding? And then this evening, Kamala Harris is also supposed to be addressing the nation in the very same area where Donald Trump addressed the nation on January 6th. So today is going to be quite an interesting day.
But you have to hand it to Donald Trump that he's been outspent 3-1 by the Harris campaign, and yet, according to the polls, the two candidates are neck and neck. So clearly, with a lot less money, he's managing to deliver a much better return on investment to those who've contributed to his campaign. Clearly, his messages are still chiming with a huge section of the U.S. population.
Once again, I don't think necessarily it's because he's the answer. I think it's because you look at the other option. When you had President Biden, everybody knew, everyone who was being honest with themselves knew that there was something cognitively wrong. And that's just something that unfortunately comes with age with many people. And so people did not feel confident or comfortable with moving forward with him. And then once they replaced him with Kamala Harris, she may, come off as somebody who's joyful. She loves to use that word, as somebody who's positive and ready to move forward. But the problem is she also comes across as somebody who is known for having a word salad, who doesn't sit down and do her research, and who comes across as extremely weak puppet. And so that all works in his favor. It's not that he's necessarily the answer.
But from an economic point of view, and the economy is time and time again the top issue on voters' minds. I mean, people have fond memories of the Trump years, notably with regards to his record on the economy and the employment rate and everything else, do they not?
They do, but we also have short-term memories. I mean, we're now in a day and age where you've got 30-second blurbs, you've got, X on posts that people follow, and you've got short attention spans more so than ever. So, that's an area where I think the Trump campaign has failed miserably, is they should have just been repeating that message over and over and over and just banging it into our heads, reminding us about the good that actually ensued under a Trump administration and how they were going to pick up the pieces and move forward with that game plan and actually make it even more so positive. But instead, we keep hearing about, Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs, or the fact that Puerto Rico is now, a garbage island. I mean, it gets completely dissolved. The message gets completely dissolved by these inane comments.
I know foreign policy isn't high up the list of voter concerns, but some people internationally view the Trump presidency as, there were no wars during the Trump presidency, and there's a lot of optimism that if Donald Trump does win a second term of office, he'll be able to put a stop to quite a lot of the conflicts that have broken out in the last few years. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, that's what he says. And so, if he is reelected, I sure hope that's the truth. because I know that you have a lot of people, no matter what your party affiliation, they are very concerned about what's going on around the world and how it does affect us here at home and our loved ones who happen to live in those parts of the world. So, I think that having us return to that era of peace would be phenomenal. But he, makes a lot of promises. And so, it will be interesting to see exactly what kind of relationships he has now with some of the new leaders that are across the pond, so to speak, that maybe weren't in those positions at that time when he was president.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. We're out of time now. Amy Tarkanian, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, for more, I'm joined now by the former speechwriter to former President Barack Obama and the best-selling author David Litt. David, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. We heard from your former boss, Barack Obama, on Monday. He said, reject the politics of division and hatred. And just looking at this election from the outside in, I mean, we're hearing a lot of extreme rhetoric being used. And just first of all, tell us, is it always like this, or is the 2024 campaign rather unusual in this respect?
Well, I think in many ways, ever since Donald Trump began running for president, we have experienced levels of division and, as President Obama said, hatred that we just have not before in our politics, certainly in my lifetime. So in that sense, unfortunately, this has become the kind of exhausting new normal. And it's why I think a lot of voters, even some voters who are going to vote for Trump, are really sick of his antics. At the same time, I think the 2024 campaign has been different. Trump clearly feels that after January 6th, after being criminally convicted and his campaign still moving forward, he has permission to say and do things that even 2020 Trump or 2016 Trump would have said are unhinged. And I think that's something we saw at this rally at Madison Square Garden on Sunday, but we've frankly seen it all through this campaign. So I think this is an escalation of what we've already seen from Donald Trump, and it's dividing an already divided country even further.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Madison Square Garden and the whole Puerto Rico furor. I mean, that was all the result of a joke cracked by Tony Hinchcliffe, who's a comedian. And you were at one point the speechwriter and the scriptwriter for the White House Correspondent's dinner speeches. So you've got a good sense of humor. And I gather you're also working on a sitcom at the moment about life in D.C. So let me ask you this. One commentator said to us yesterday, the Democrats don't have a sense of humor, and that's why they're getting so upset about that Puerto Rico comment. How do you respond to that?
What I would say is Tony Hinchcliffe seems like the kind of guy who goes to a funeral and says a bunch of, insulting jokes and then says, how come you don't have a sense of humor? Like, there's a time and a place. This isn't complicated. I wrote jokes for President Obama. As you said, I've written comedy outside of my political work. And there are venues that make sense for this. I mean, there are certainly offensive jokes that I have enjoyed in life. I think most of us, if we're being honest, have. But the fact that the Trump campaign, we now know, by the way, vetted these remarks. They saw the remarks. They took out other stuff because they said it was too offensive. So clearly they did think some jokes were inappropriate. And then they put him up there with a Trump Vance sign at the biggest night for the Trump campaign in Trump campaign history and said, all right, go for it. And I think that says a lot about what a second Trump presidency would look like. And it's why this is breaking through, both with Puerto Rican voters, but also with voters who say, Donald Trump does not seem interested in solving our problems. He seems interested in this kind of parade of division. And I think that's why, that this is having an impact at a moment when I think a lot of people thought that, Donald Trump is Teflon, nothing breaks through. This really is.
Yeah, so what you're saying is something we've been hearing quite a bit, which is that there's an element of shooting oneself in the foot here, and that this insult, as it's perceived by a lot of people of Latino heritage, is actually quite damaging for Donald Trump and for the Republicans, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately this campaign, like every campaign, comes down to the question of who is going to fight for you. And just generally speaking, if somebody invites someone on stage to insult you, they're probably not going to fight for you when they're president, right? I think President Obama said something sort of similar to that. I think I'm paraphrasing him. And I think that's, is it going to turn a close election into a landslide victory for Kamala Harris? Sadly, at least from my perspective, it won't. This is still going to be a very close race. But I do think that the mask is coming off and that people are saying, okay, Donald Trump is not going to be some economic genius. He is focused on revenge. He's focused on his own grievances. He's focused on these weird sort of stoking divisions in order to distract us and divide us. That's not a plan to deal with the stuff that I care about, that my family cares about, right? One of the things that really struck me was the story coming out of that rally had nothing to do with how he would bring down prices or deal with rising costs. Those are the biggest issues to voters. And that rally said, we don't care about that stuff. All we care about is our weird sort of, hateful things.
So Americans of Latino and in particular Puerto Rican heritage basically could, in some swing states, end up deciding the outcome of this election, couldn't they? I mean, how important is the Latino vote to the chances of either candidate?
The Latino vote is very important. We have seen that Trump has, according to polls, been making up some ground there. He's still probably not going to, be shocked if he beat Harris among Latinos, but he'll come closer than I think a lot of Democrats would like. And so if this causes some Latinos to reconsider or causes others to turn out who might otherwise say, no, I'm going to sit this one out, that's very important. But I just do want to say what happened at that rally was not merely offensive to Latinos, was not merely offensive to Puerto Ricans. I'm neither of those categories of person, but as an American, I was really appalled by that. And I think you see a lot of other Americans who say the same thing. There's a lot of voters in the suburbs, right, who are independent-minded, maybe former Republicans, have been trending toward Democrats. And what they keep saying is, what Trump is doing is just too disgusting, too unacceptable for me to be comfortable with. And I think if you had any more of those suburban voters on the fence who said, maybe I can stomach a vote for this guy, the rally at Madison Square Garden is a reminder of what so many Americans are ready to turn the page on Donald Trump, right? We're so tired of this.
Sure, those sort of, I think it's about 3 to 5%, isn't it, of undecided voters at this particular stage in the race. And what you're saying is that these comments and this kind of rhetoric could actually swing them. Do you think it would swing them more than perhaps their position or their beliefs about the economy, about immigration, democracy, abortion, some of the other big issues that are usually at the forefront of voters' minds?
So people are complicated. I think most people make their decision based on a variety of factors. I think what you're going to have is a lot of people who, falsely, in my view, remember the Trump years fondly economically, but also remember Donald Trump and who he is, and they really don't like him. And they're trying to balance those two things out. Is my fear about what Donald Trump would do if we give him another term so great that it outweighs my fond memories, whether they're accurate or not, of the first Trump term and the economy under that, in Trump's first few years before COVID. So, it's a balancing test. And Sunday's rally was more or less like putting a giant weight on one end of the scale. Some people will still say, I'm sure, I have, no choice. I've got to vote for Trump. I don't agree with that, but some people will say it. I think other people will say, okay, I liked the economy under him, but this is too far, right? This is just too far. And so I think in a close election, if you want to be winning votes, not losing them, I just think that's the most obvious idea in politics, but it's one that I think the Trump campaign clearly forgot at their big rally on Sunday.
Okay, so we've talked quite a bit already about Latino voters and their voter intentions. We've been talking quite a bit on this channel about the Arab American voters and Muslim American voters and their intentions in this election. And I think it's fair to say that the war in Israel has been more damaging to the Democrats than it would be for Donald Trump, because, of course, they are the party in office. I mean, would you agree with that? And just how much do you think the war in Gaza and the Biden administration's policy towards Israel and the situation broadly in the region, how much that's cost, do you think, Kamala Harris?
So I'm glad you brought up Gaza, both because it's an important issue in the campaign, it's an important issue in the world, also because it was something else that came up at this rally, right? Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York City, and a big, important Trump surrogate, said, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said Palestinians grow up to hate Americans and that Trump is going to keep refugees from Gaza out of this country. And he said a bunch of other nasty things. I do think that Donald Trump, because he has not been in office during this war, has benefited from kind of, he's gotten the benefit of the doubt, right? I think there's some group of Arab American voters who have said, maybe he would be better on this issue than Kamala Harris would. I think that, again, I am sure that that comment from Rudy Giuliani is spreading right now in communities where people say, wait a second, his agenda is substantially worse than Harris's. That may not mean that there's no crossover at all, right? I do think that the war in Gaza has had a real impact. Of course it has. But I think that it's this kind of 11th hour moment where people are realizing, hey, wait a second, Donald Trump is not just a generic alternative. He has a plan, and his plan is extremely, it's much more in line with our worst case scenario than Kamala Harris's. So I think that these things are they're happening, but they're not done happening, right? This election isn't over yet, and I think we're already seeing people at the last minute say, wait a second, are we really sure we want to do this?
At the beginning, when Kamala Harris became the Democratic Party's nominee for the race for the White House, people felt they didn't really know all that much about her. There was a sense, who is this woman who's been vice president for these last nearly 4 years that we haven't heard a huge amount from? Do you think that's a fair perception? And do you think that perception has changed during these last 3 months that she's been on the campaign trail, and that people now do feel at last they do know a bit more about her?
Yeah, I think that they absolutely do know substantially more about her. And more importantly, for the Harris campaign's perspective, the more voters have gotten to know her, the more they like her. That said, voters who ultimately will matter the most in this election because they haven't made up their minds are often the ones who follow politics least closely. So many undecided voters or potentially undecided voters are the same group of voters who said, I never really heard of Kamala Harris before this. So then the question becomes, how has the perception of her changed over the last few months when she's been the nominee? Her favorable ratings have gone way up. That's pretty unprecedented. Most important, her attributes. In polling, they would say attribute questions are, is she a strong leader? Does she fight for people like me? Especially that last one is really important. And we've seen those numbers climbing and climbing and climbing. So this is going to be a close election. I'm not suggesting it isn't, but those were sort of necessary conditions for a Harris victory. And I think those conditions have been met. And now the question for Harris is, can she get over the top, right? Can she convince people that she's ready to be president and that she is going to make their lives better? I think she's convinced a lot of people, but if she can convince just a few more, this goes from a sort of 50-50 race to something that the Harris campaign would feel pretty comfortable about.
Yeah, maybe some of those undecided voters will be listening tonight because Kamala Harris is going to make an important speech tonight, isn't she? And she's chosen a really symbolic location for it in D.C. What sort of things do you think we should be listening out for in this so-called closing argument speech tonight?
Well, you mentioned the location, and she's going to be in Washington, D.C., but more than that, she's going to be on the Ellipse, which is where Donald Trump gave his speech telling his supporters to storm the Capitol. And I don't know if she's going to bring that up or not, but the contrast just visually and the message it's sending is very clear. I think the idea she wants voters to imagine, do we want President Harris or do we want President Trump? This is what President Harris would look like and do. This is what President Trump looked like and did when he actually had the power that he now seeks again. And I imagine, without knowing anything exactly about what she'll say in the speech, she's going to really focus on the next 4 years, right? And most importantly, and this is something I think she's done well, she's going to focus on what it means for voters, what it means for the American people, what it means for you and your family. Because I think that's a big thing that Trump is failing to do, right? I mean, he has not had a lot of detailed plans about how to help people. He spends a lot of time talking about himself. And I think if Harris can convince people, all right, I haven't known her for decades like I've known Donald Trump, but she seems like her heart is in the right place. She's fighting for me. She laid out some ideas that I like. No candidate is going to cross the threshold of, I'm 100% sure they've satisfied every single concern. That just never happens in politics. But if you can get people to a place where they trust you, then they're going to vote for you.
Some people have criticized Kamala Harris for focusing too much, and this is coming from people who actually support her as well, for calling out Donald Trump's inflammatory comments a bit too often. Do you think that's something she's done too often and perhaps not spent enough time focusing on her own vision and more time than she should have done focusing on or responding to inflammatory comments, which have ultimately gone on to serve Donald Trump better than her?
Well, let me start by saying, as a political communications person, right, I've been doing this for a while. The first question I always ask is not what should we say, it's what's the truth? And the truth is that Donald Trump is extraordinarily dangerous. And it's not just his inflammatory comments, it's what he says he will do if he gets the kind of power that he wants without the guardrails that existed in the last term, right? Just to go through a couple of them. He wants to use the military to persecute his political enemies. He said this publicly many, many times. He wants to round up undocumented immigrants, including people not just who crossed the border recently, but have lived here for decades, and put them in militarized camps using a law from 1798. He wants to ban abortion. Now, he says he won't sign a national ban, but he could use another law from more than 100 years ago called the Comstock Act to effectively ban abortion nationwide. And so all of these things and many, many more are genuinely really, really frightening and dangerous, not to mention the fact that he doesn't respect elections and democracy. So yes, Kamala Harris absolutely should be saying that because it's true and because voters care about it. But she's doing something else which I think is very important. She's also saying this is going to affect your life. It's not just an ideological or intellectual exercise that we need to protect democracy or that Donald Trump is, a vulgar bad guy. It's that he is laser focused on his enemies list, as she's put it, where she's saying, I'm focused on my to-do list. I think that was a really smart rhetorical contrast, because what she's basically saying is Trump's obsession with stuff about revenge and, using the military to go after Americans. Not only is that very bad from a moral perspective, even more than that, it's taking the eye off the ball when it comes to the stuff that matters to you. And I think if she can make that case, she can sort of do two things at once. And when you do two things at once in politics, it's difficult, but it tends to be effective.
Yeah, and in fact, Donald Trump, one of the things he said in the last, I think it was on yesterday in one of his speeches, he said that Michelle Obama had made a big mistake, quote unquote, for being nasty to him in a recent speech. And I wonder what, it does sound rather threatening, doesn't it, that kind of language, saying you've made a big mistake. What's he getting at here?
It's fascinating to me that you're right. That does sound threatening. It's probably one of it wouldn't make the top 100 list of most threatening things that Donald Trump has said, right? I mean, when you're talking about using the military to go after the Americans who oppose you, calling someone nasty doesn't even rate, which is shocking and goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this conversation. This is not how politics used to be. I would also point out, I don't think Donald Trump has met a woman yet who disagrees with him who he has not called nasty. So that's not really surprising.
But it was more about the big mistake aspect of the comment that struck me, because it sounds like there's a threat behind that.
Well, it sounds like I think my general rule, because I like true crime books about the mafia and organized crime. Every book I've ever read about organized crime families is a book about Donald Trump and the way that he sees power. And it's somewhat similar to, if you're a organized crime boss and you say, I don't know, that seems like a problem for you, right? You're saying something without saying it. And Trump loves to talk in those sort of undertones, right? He's telling his supporters, these are bad people, but he's not specifically ordering them to do something illegal or, something that he can put his hands on. And I think that is true. I mean, I think people are just so tired of that kind of bullying language. Now, Michelle Obama, I think, is, she's tough enough to take it. But I also think, by the way, it's a sign that what Michelle Obama said, where I think he was talking about her describing what life would look like for women under a Trump administration and really imploring men who care about women, which is most men, to think about that when they cast their votes. It's a sign that it clearly got under his skin and that he's worried that it's having an impact.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm told we're out of time, but it's been great speaking to you. David Litt, former speechwriter and a best-selling author. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
There are 7 pivotal swing states: Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Nevada. They are poised to determine the outcome of this election, prompting both campaigns to concentrate their efforts there. Well, as reported by 538's Daily Poll Tracker, Harris has a slim lead in Michigan. Trump has a slight advantage over Harris in Pennsylvania and Nevada, along with a more significant lead in North Carolina, Arizona, and Georgia. Well, in Wisconsin, the race is incredibly tight, with less than 1/10 of a percentage point separating the two candidates. Well, across all 7 states, the candidates are within 2 points of each other. That's well within the poll's margin of error, making each state a toss-up. This, of course, just days before the election. Well, for more, I'm joined now by the Republican pollster and president and CEO of the Tarrant's Group, BJ Martino. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to Al Arabiya News. It's an incredibly tight-looking election at this particular moment. So I just want to start by asking you how you've seen the polls evolving during the course of the last couple of weeks.
Well, the last couple of weeks, relative to all of the events of this election cycle, have been relatively consistent, although certainly showing an increasing level of intensity and support for the Trump campaign. You've seen, obviously, going back to June when President Biden was still on the ballot, the advantages that Trump had, that all the world turned upside down when Kamala Harris became the nominee. And we all agreed in the polling community and many others that it would take some time for the fundamentals of this race to come back to normal. And I think we've really seen that now, where although each of the critical states in this election are incredibly close, there does seem to be a little bit of that momentum late for Trump.
I mean, obviously, this is the top news story, not just in the US, but in many countries around the world. The US election capturing the headlines everywhere. And I'm just wondering whether this keen interest in the election is going to translate, in your opinion, into voter participation, because we're seeing about 40 million people casting their ballots early so far. I mean, what are your thoughts? Are we looking at a high turnout here?
I think we are looking at a high turnout. There were a lot of models and suggestions that turnout in this election would be something lower than we saw in 2020. But to your point, the absentee and early voting that we've seen in a lot of states suggests that there is some of those voters who have perhaps only voted in one presidential or have not voted in a presidential election in their lifetime, who are coming to the polls and casting ballots early. So I would not be surprised ultimately if we see something commensurate with the 2020 turnout, which was quite high for our country.
And then we've got these undecided voters between 3 and 5%, or maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on that stats, but perhaps you have a better or more accurate statistic. But I've been reading somewhere between 3 and 5% of voters are undecided. What do you think is likely to swing them at the late stage?
I honestly don't think at this point in the election there is many, if any, voters who are truly undecided in this race. Perhaps they're unwilling to tell a pollster, or they're not asked in the right way to make sure to reveal that preference. But the fact is, at this point, voters have a preference one way or the other. There's going to be very little new information that's going to change a voter's mind one way or the other in this last week. In fact, oftentimes we find that late breaking bits of information that come out are either accepted or rejected by a voter as true based on where their existing impression was. Now, we saw this a little bit different in 2016 when there were a number of voters who had an unfavorable impression of both Trump and Clinton at the time. And there was some late breaking news that perhaps broke some voters against Clinton. Here, we see a different dynamic at play. We have two presidential candidates, one of whom, when you ask voters about job approval, how Trump did as president versus how they believe Harris is doing as a vice president, have a little bit more confidence and approval of the way Trump did. At the same time, when you ask personal image of the candidates, how do you view this person individually, the voters tend to have a little bit more personal favorability towards Harris. That said, it's all going to come down, I think, ultimately for the final voters are they making this judgment based on their personal views and personalities, which is ultimately the argument that the Harris campaign is making, or are they going to make this decision based on how they view this person's ability to do the job as president, either reflecting back on President Trump's time versus Harris's time? That decision and the framework in which they approach the ballot box, either personal views or views about the job, that for any of those late breakers is going to be the deciding factor.
BJ, you raised a really interesting point there, which is that some people that you poll or that your team of pollsters poll don't necessarily want to tell the pollster what their voter intention is. And I'm just wondering why that is. I mean, what sort of reasons are there for people not wanting to tell a pollster what they're planning to do?
Well, oftentimes they are inundated with calls, especially at this time of the year. They've been answering a lot of questions. They've been receiving a lot of text and mail and television. And frankly, a lot of voters are simply exhausted of being probed and prodded by individuals like myself and others in campaigns. But I think it takes good polling methodology to make sure you get those revealed preferences. One thing that we always do is make sure that even if someone says they are undecided, probe them a little bit on which way they might lean. And leaners, ultimately, they'll begin to reveal some of that preference. You ask voters how others they know are voting. You can ask them who they think might win the election. There are other ways you can ask questions in a survey to tease out where those self-described undecided voters are in actuality.
There are, of course, 7 swing states that look like they're going to decide who the winning candidate is. And I just want to ask you whether, you mentioned voter fatigue in the United States, but do you think it's particularly true of the swing states, where we've seen in some states candidates visiting, 10 times or more in some cases during the course of this campaign? Do you think those people are particularly fatigued? And then conversely, do you think people in non-swing states feel a little bit neglected? They're not being visited quite as much.
Well, that's a constant in American politics, and I think voters have grown accustomed to the level of attention that they receive. And in the swing states, I would say that there are an expectation for voters to see their presidential candidates come personally to the state, to show up there personally, to demonstrate that they have a level of concern and desire to address the issues of the voters of that state. So when I talk about the fatigue, there's the process fatigue, I think, for a lot of voters. The fact that they can't turn on their televisions or watch streaming content or put their phone down for a minute because there's always another political add-on, or there's always another text asking for those last $5 contributions, or pollsters like myself reaching out to them. So there's a process fatigue that begins to set in, and voters oftentimes, I think, you find that voters who participate early tend to be those who are the most locked in. They've made their decision, and by voting, oftentimes they remove themselves from the list of target voters on both sides of the campaign. They start receiving fewer calls, fewer texts, because they've been identified as someone who's already voted. But when you look at the other states, there's a lot going on as well. We have all of our congressional races going on. There's a number of Senate races, many of them in the contested presidential states. So I don't think there's a feeling of neglect in the other states, but certainly not the same level of intensity of contact that those in the swing states are feeling on a day-to-day basis, and will continue through next Tuesday.
For people who don't want either of the 2 main candidates to win, 2 options really. One is obviously not to vote at all. Another one might be to vote, for example, for the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, who I believe is on about 1%, according to the polls. Correct me if I'm wrong. But what sort of a difference do you think she and that potentially all-important 1% could make to the outcome of the election?
The fact is, there are a number of candidates in different states third-party candidates who remain on the ballot. Even Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is on the ballot in certain states. Stein is on in certain states. There are others in certain states. But absolutely, those supporting those candidates are perhaps legitimately supportive of those candidates, but they have no chance, obviously. And in states, these 7 states that we keep talking about, where the margin is anywhere between 1 or 2 points on the average only between the candidates, if not a dead heat, those votes can absolutely matter and can spoil the race for someone who they otherwise might have voted for, and can swing the results. So if the presence of these third-party candidates is critically important, is going to play a role ultimately in many of these places.
Yeah, and I imagine that makes the job of polling all the more difficult as well. One of the polls I've just had a look at, a CNN poll, says that only 30% of Americans believe that Donald Trump will concede if he's defeated. What do you think about that? And when do you think we'll know what? Do you think we'll have a clear outcome on the 5th of November?
Well, I don't think we'll have a clear outcome that night unless there is some large indications in the early states that one of the candidates has taken advantage. And we'll begin to get results in places like North Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania earlier in the evening than some of the Midwestern states like Wisconsin and Michigan. And we won't get Nevada and Arizona till later in the evening. But I do think that if there is some major shifting in those states, if one candidate or the other has a large advantage and we can call those early states, we'll know. Barring that, I don't think we'll know that evening necessarily who is going to be the president. Now, that said, we could still see even a narrow popular vote victory can result in a large electoral victory. There are so many states that are on this knife's edge in terms of the polling right now and who might have an advantage, that if they all break one way, and even though it may be just by a point or two, all those electoral college votes go to that candidate and therefore could create that sort of landslide effect, or that idea that there is a large electoral college victory that cements the results going into then January when we'd put a new president in place.
One thing we've talked about a lot the last 24 hours here at Al Arabiya News are the comments made by Tony Hinchcliffe during a rally in Madison Square Garden on Sunday. Given that 19% of the US electorate is of Hispanic or Latino origin, I mean, obviously that's a key demographic. And I want to know whether you think those comments have had a significant impact or are likely to have a significant impact on the polls going forward. And are there any other moments that have really stood out for you during this election campaign that have had some significant impact one way or the other on the polls?
Well, I think that this comment is ultimately a tempest that the media have tried to foment and create larger. It's a comedian speaking at a rally. It was not the candidate himself. It wasn't anyone officially on the campaign side. Ultimately, is what a comedian, a bad, in poor taste joke said, determines someone's vote for president. I don't think that this has any sort of real impact on where Hispanic voters break. I mean, we have seen over time in the last couple election cycles that Hispanic voters have been more drawn to Donald Trump than they have in other Republicans in the past. And it's been on a lot of the same issues that have mattered to voters writ large, starting with economic concerns. But other moments in time in this election that obviously I think have been important, we can't go past again the idea that the Democratic Party removed their sitting president as the nominee and put the vice president in without her having received a single vote in a primary anywhere. That was an amazing moment in our politics that happened that for a long time, in much of the summer and into the early fall, had an enormous impact on where the numbers were, what voters were thinking, and how everything is going to ultimately shake out. The attempts on President Trump's life, I think, were also seminal moments, particularly for the Republican base who rallied behind the president, former president. And they've done that on a number of occasions. You even think back to the early days when we were looking at the Republican primary. The most important moment in time in the Republican primary for Donald Trump was the day he was first indicted. We saw Republican base voters jump 6 to 7 points in a primary setting in support of Donald Trump because of that perceived politicization of the legal system against him. And that almost ensured his candidacy at that point. So there have been several critical points throughout all of this this campaign, but the most critical one is yet to come on the 5th.
Indeed, and it certainly hasn't been boring. This is my last question to you, BJ, and sorry to put you on the spot here, but who's your money on?
My money's on Trump right now. If you look at the state-by-state numbers, it's all within the margin, but there's a slight edge for Trump here. You've seen a little bit of shifting there. I hesitate to put too much confidence in public numbers shifting late, as we saw in 22. There was this perception of a red wave building where it was just a result of bad public polls out there. So you don't really put too much confidence in that. But when I look at my numbers state by state, and I look at where the national numbers are here, it's a difficult road for the Harris campaign, I think, to go through all of those 7 states. And there's some early indication today that they have already given up on North Carolina, the Harris campaign pulling some campaign dollars out of North Carolina. So essentially ceding that state to Donald Trump, and then taking those dollars, probably putting them into Pennsylvania or some other state that they think they still need to win. Those indicators suggest for me, if I had, and I don't gamble on the election, but you would put the money on Trump right now.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us. Republican pollster and president and CEO of the Terrence Group, BJ Martino. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the Israeli parliament has voted to ban the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency from operating in Israel and occupied East Jerusalem, alleging its collusion with Hamas. Well, the legislation prohibits contact between UNRWA employees and Israeli officials within 3 months. That'll mean restricting aid operations in Gaza and the West Bank. Well, cooperation with the Israeli military is crucial for UNRWA's aid delivery, as it is the primary UN organization in the region. Well, the US and the UK have raised serious concerns. The US State Department urging Israel to reconsider that ban, calling UNRWA irreplaceable for humanitarian aid in Gaza. Well, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the implementation of a law banning the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, from operating in Israel would, quote, have devastating consequences for Palestinian refugees in the occupied Palestinian territory, which he said is unacceptable. Well, in a statement, he said he's deeply concerned by the adoption of 2 laws concerning UNRWA's works there. And he added that if implemented, they would likely prevent UNRWA from continuing its essential work in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. He went on to say UNRWA is the principal means by which the essential assistance is supplied to Palestinian refugees in the occupied Palestinian territory, and the implementation of the laws could have devastating consequences for them. Well, I'm joined now by Shana Lowe, Communications Advisor at the Norwegian Refugee Council. Shana, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Al Arabiya News. Israel has voted to ban UNRWA, the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency. What's your reaction?
This is bound to have catastrophic effects on the Palestinians living in the OPT and in the occupied Palestinian territory and throughout the region, particularly those in Gaza who have now faced a year of hostilities, a year of Israeli bombardment, and are desperate for the aid that UNRWA and other humanitarian agencies are providing.
Okay, just tell us what this is going to then translate into for the average Palestinian person, in particular people in northern Gaza that are really cut off at this point?
Well, UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza. They have a huge footprint there and are responsible for much of the coordination that is happening amongst humanitarian agencies. They provide fuel, for example, to humanitarian agencies so that they can go in and execute their distributions. At the same time, UNRWA is providing all sorts of services that Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza, are reliant on. Everything from food distributions to the provision of medical services, as well as educational services. Of course, schools in Gaza have been closed for the last year, as many of the schools have been converted to shelters for those who have been displaced. But UNRWA is really the only organization situated to help restart schools once conditions allow.
So what you're basically saying go ahead.
And in terms of the people in northern Gaza, very little aid at all is reaching them at this point. There's about an estimated 100,000 people in a besieged portion of northern Gaza who are getting zero aid at the moment. So while even UNRWA is not really able to reach those people in need, as soon as conditions allow, UNRWA will, of course, along with other humanitarian partners, be on the front lines responding to those acute needs that we're hearing about and seeing in northern Gaza.
So what you've said is that basically UNRWA has a role that, obviously them not being there is going to leave a huge vacuum, and it's not a vacuum that can be filled by any other agency. Is that basically it?
That's right. UNRWA is really irreplaceable at this moment. They have over 70 years of history working in Gaza. They have a huge staff that is able to respond and meet the needs of people in Gaza, and no humanitarian agency, as much as they might try and scale up, will be able to fill the void that a loss of UNRWA would lead to.
One of the Israeli lawmakers who supported the bill banning UNRWA, Sharon Haskell, said Israel has the absolute right to act against UNRWA. This ban doesn't come into effect, does it, for 3 months? And I'm just wondering whether you think perhaps in these 3 months something might be done, something might happen to stop this, appeal this, or reverse this decision.
Well, I think world leaders need to do everything in their power to ensure that this bill, this law now does not go into effect. As I said, it will have catastrophic impact on Palestinian refugees and those who have been internally displaced inside of Gaza. I think it's really important to look at this at a larger scale and not just in terms of what happened last night with this vote, but the assault on the international system, on the UN system, on humanitarian agencies, and our ability to fulfill our mission, which is to help people who are in need. And we've seen obstruction after obstruction put in place by the Israeli authorities, whether it's preventing aid from entering Gaza, closing crossings, or creating a situation on the ground where we simply do not have access to be able to reach those who are in need. This is part of a bigger assault on humanitarian work in general and the UN system more particularly.
But can Israel act in this way unilaterally? I mean, legally speaking, let's talk about UNRWA. It was founded in 1949 by a UN General Assembly resolution. Can they simply be banned, or does that decision not have to come from the UN Security Council, for example?
I'm not an expert in terms of how UN procedures work, but I think it simply is unprecedented that we're seeing a UN member state try to expel a UN body that actually, I believe it was the UN General Assembly that brought UNRWA into existence. And so I think that it's likely or potential that there could be consequences for Israel in terms of its UN membership, because this is a dangerous precedent to set, not just in the occupied Palestinian territory, but globally for countries who might not like the things that the UN is doing to support migrants or refugees or people who are displaced. This could be a model that other countries that are not friendly to humanitarian agencies that are not friendly to the UN could adopt.
Yeah, indeed, this language, dangerous precedent, was exactly the words used by the UNRWA chief, Philippe Lazzarini. He called this a form of collective punishment for the Gazan people. I mean, do you think that's an accurate assessment?
Absolutely. There are 1.9 million Palestinians, 90% of the population in Gaza, that are displaced. These are innocent civilians, men, women, children, the elderly, who have nothing to do with this armed conflict that's been raging for over a year now. And these are the people who are going to face the consequences. The innocent civilians that have suffered unimaginably over the last year will continue to face the brunt of these political decisions.
Let's talk about what Israel is saying. I'd like to get your opinions on this. I mean, Israel's saying UNRWA has links to and has employed 190 people who have ties to Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants. I'm just wondering, what's the evidence for this?
You know, Israel has produced very scant evidence. My understanding is that UNRWA, when allegations came to light, they conducted their own investigations, had independent investigations in the UN, terminated the contracts or suspended the contracts of those who were under investigation. But it simply is crazy to hold an organization responsible for the acts of its employees acting in their individual personal capacities. Can you imagine if Al Arabiya was to blame, if you, for example, had committed a crime? This is just absurd.
Yeah, I was just doing the maths. I mean, there are 30,000 Palestinians working for UNRWA. They've got evidence, they say, about 190 of them. That's 0.006% of the staff body. The Israeli Prime Minister's office says this isn't going to affect humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip. He says humanitarian aid must remain available in Gaza now and in the future. How's that going to happen without UNRWA then?
You know, we really don't know. There aren't really contingency plans because UNRWA has been such an important part of the humanitarian response, not just in the last year, but over the last 75 years that they've been working in Gaza. I also find it ironic that the Israeli Prime Minister is talking about maintaining humanitarian aid in Gaza when so little aid is actually entering Gaza and able to reach the people. And each day we're seeing that the needs are growing and growing.
Yeah, I mean, another politician I wanted to draw to your attention, Boaz Bismuth, a member of Likud, and of course Likud were the architects of this bill that banned UNRWA. Anyone who behaves like a terrorist has no rights in Israel. UNRWA equals Hamas, period. How do you respond to that?
I don't even know how to respond to a statement like this, which is so absurd when UNRWA has been providing and continues to provide humanitarian assistance and other services to those in need, Palestinian refugees in Gaza, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. It's just an absurd statement.
Let's talk about what the situation is right now in Gaza. Today in Beit Lahia, which I believe is in the north of Gaza, 109 people reported to have been killed, many of the victims displaced people. What more can you tell us about the humanitarian situation in that particular part of Gaza?
Well, the northernmost part of Gaza, which includes Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, and Jabalia, including the Jabalia refugee camp, have been under an extremely tight siege since the start of this month. Basically, no aid is getting in and reaching those people. Water has been cut off, food has been cut off, medicine supplies have been cut off. And what I heard from my staff, who was just in Gaza, in northern Gaza late last week in Gaza City, is that the few people that have managed, the tens of thousands of people that have managed to flee from that area are reporting extremely serious conditions where they are even afraid to flee because they are unsure that they will be guaranteed safe passage to where they need to flee to or being told to flee to. They know that there is no safety in any other part of Gaza. We've seen even the unilaterally declared so-called humanitarian zone that Israel established is not immune from attack and has been targeted several times. And so the situation in the north is extremely dire and is really not getting enough attention in terms of the tremendous needs that are continuing to grow and the fact that humanitarians do not have access to go and meet those needs.
So if no aid is getting into some of these areas, I mean, we must be very close to a situation where large numbers of people are going to die of starvation, aren't we?
I think that's probably the case, and I think Israel has been very clear in their strategy here that they are aiming to starve people out of those areas in northern Gaza and force them to flee. They're saying that people who choose not to flee will likely be considered combatants, and even if they are civilians, and be targeted. So I think we're seeing a situation where Israel is using this siege to try and forcibly displace and clear out all of the people living in northern Gaza.
Let's talk about what you'd like to see world leaders do. You said world leaders must act. Obviously, quite a lot of world leaders have expressed grave concern. Who would you like to hear saying what? And you know, perhaps to anticipate part of your answer, just for the benefit of our viewers, really, the top donor states for UNRWA are the United States, Germany, the European Union, Sweden, Norway, Japan, France, Saudi Arabia. Those are some of the top donors. So what would you like to see perhaps those countries saying and doing?
Well, first of all, those countries need to use all lawful measures that they can to counter this behavior from Israel, whether that's Security Council resolutions or other things. That's up to them to decide what to do. I think there needs to be a commitment not to reallocate funds earmarked for UNRWA to other agencies, because we know that other agencies cannot fill the gap from UNRWA. And then, of course, there are the larger things that we've been asking for a year now. The first and foremost is a ceasefire, a permanent, sustained ceasefire, so that people can start rebuilding their lives, start their recovery process, start the reconstruction process. One way to go about doing that is to stop transferring weapons to Israel and to put an end to this.
Some of the countries I mentioned, though, the US, the UK, Germany, are amongst the countries that back in January decided they were going to suspend their funding of UNRWA. I believe they've reinstated it. But why did they do that back in January?
Well, I believe that the U.S. has not yet reinstated the funds to UNRWA, though they have, in a letter that was sent by Secretary Blinken and I believe Defense Secretary Austin, said that UNRWA must be protected and not banned. This was in response to the allegations that Israel made about the members of UNRWA who had participated in the atrocities on October 7th. Many of those states have now, after UNRWA's review, reinstated those funds. And I think it's important for the United States in particular to resume those funds to demonstrate, not just in words, but in actions, the importance of UNRWA to the humanitarian response in Gaza.
Okay, well, we're out of time now, but I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Shana Lowe of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.
That is all we have time for on Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Cairo, one of the world's greatest megacities, Cairo. It is rich in its historic finery, while at the same time known for its extremely hot weather, traffic, and yes, noise and air pollution. While it is perhaps the city that tourists both love and hate, The experience makes it rather worth the challenges. It's got history that spans centuries, the city is full of vigor, and Cairo is a place to be when you're looking to experience the Egyptian street life. It is, in fact, where the only surviving wonder of the ancient world is. No words can describe the majestic view of the 3 5,000-year-old pyramids on the Giza Plateau. One of the most popular ones is the King's Chamber, considered one of the deepest man-made silences on Earth. Of course, you can't miss the Sphinx. It is both an enormous sight and an overwhelming experience you will never forget. It serves as a guard of the pyramids with its lion body and pharaoh face. It is certainly an iconic monument of the ancient world. You can take hours-long camel rides to get through the pyramids. Despite the heat, dust, and other hurdles while traveling, it is definitely worth it. The Pyramids of Cheops, also called the Great Pyramid or the Pyramid of Khufu, is the largest pyramid of the Giza group. You can explore the mysterious interiors of its narrow passages. There's also the Solar Boat Museum behind it, where you will see the ceremonial solar barks that's amazingly been restored to its original glory. On the south, there's a Pyramid of Khafre, which is also known as the Pyramid of Khafre. It also has an internal tunnel that invites you to explore it. Finally, there's the smaller Pyramid of Mycerinus, or the Pyramid of Menkaure. When it comes to shopping, you must visit Khan el-Khalili, which is considered to have one of the world's greatest shopping experiences. Its narrow alleyways have been established since 1400 AD, and up to now is still up and about with all sorts of trade, from tiny stores to cluttered workshops. For sports and recreation, find tennis courts around the south of Jazeera or ride the stables at the sports club. The Cairo Tower, built in 1961 by President Nasser, offers you an amazing view of the sunset at its observation deck.
Welcome to the show. I'm Riz Khan. The annual cost of cybercrime is expected to reach $10 trillion next year. To put that figure into context, in terms of GDP, it would be the third biggest economy in the world after the US and China. That's why countries from Australia to China, the UK and US are racing to tighten up their cybersecurity laws. And it's why the UN is expected to pass a landmark cyber treaty in the coming weeks. From deepfakes and disinformation to hacks and attacks on infrastructure, healthcare and security networks, cybercrime is becoming the #1 challenge for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And artificial intelligence is already changing the rules of the game. Now, our increasingly connected digital world makes us all more vulnerable to criminal gangs and state-sponsored hackers who can access our data and devices. Imagine them taking control of your bank account, your electrical vehicle, and even your pacemaker. Let's continue that theme of cyber psychology with a woman whose work in the field inspired the hit TV crime drama CSI Cyber. In fact, her character is played by an Oscar-winning Hollywood actress. As many experts will tell you, humans are often regarded as the weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. Dr. Mary Aiken's work includes profiling hackers and identifying their vulnerabilities. But she's ready to back her own brain against AI any day. Dr. Mary Aiken, great to have a chance to chat with you because it's been fascinating to find out the kind of areas you cover. Now, I do want to start, though, with your role on CSI Cyber, how you've been portrayed there. Tell me about that.
Yes, actually, I was doing some work for the White House on tech solutions to human trafficking, and there was some publicity around it, and afterwards I got a call from William Morris, and I thought it was Philip Morris, the cigarette company, so I said, I don't do endorsements. Anyway, turned out to be an agency. They brought me to Hollywood. I met some people, and the next thing, they created a division of the show, CSI New York, CSI Miami, CSI Cyber, based on my work, and Patricia Arquette played me in the show.
That's pretty good. I was like, well, it's at least getting some visibility there as well. And I want to ask you, how much does a TV series like that actually portray the reality?
I think that, they're metaphors. So when we're talking about something in a television show, what we're trying to do is sort of provide explanatory value. We're trying to educate general population. So there's a famous scene that we did had this operator looking at code on the screen, and it was all green, and all of a sudden the malware showed up as red, and the operator said, oh, we've got malware. And of course the InfoSec community went crazy because they said, that's not how it works. Malware doesn't jump out as red code. But it was a metaphor that an experienced operator would see it as red code. Of course, there was all this trouble online about it and how we were dumbing down, computer science and InfoSec. And then the US Army cavalry came to my rescue in the form of West Point. And they wrote an article in defense of CSI Cyber saying how important it was. The series aired in 170 countries worldwide.
One thing is new to a lot of people is this term cyber psychology. Explain that in a simple way.
Cyber psychology is the study of the impact of technology on human behavior. It's about 20 years old as a discipline, which is really young, and I'm one of the pioneers in the field. I'm a professor of cyber psychology in London, and I'm a professor of forensic cyber psychology in the US. Forensic cyber psychology is the study of criminal, deviant and abnormal behavior, and I'm kept pretty busy.
I'm sure. And I love the fact you're not scared to speak your mind, because I know you don't really like the term cyber resilience. Explain why.
Yes, so we're here at GCF, and we had a panel earlier today talking about cyber resilience, well, cognitive resilience particularly. And I suppose, as a cyber behavioral scientist, you often come across these terms, and my guess is, and I'm probably right, I'm sure it was a term invented by a computer scientist who said, well, we've got resilience in systems, and they can, be resilient during an attack, and then they can bounce back quickly afterwards. So let's retranspose that construct to humans, and then develop resilience in humans. My point is that, okay, if we're going to talk about resilience, let's talk about the psychology of resilience. So across the general population, if you had, say, 4 people in a family, there's a strong genetic component. One person will have no resilience, 2 of them will be 50-50 on resilience, and 1 will be extremely resilient. So I object to the term because where are we going with collective cybersecurity? Is it a Darwinian push towards survival of the tech fittest? That's not fair.
So really, that is an interesting thought. Tech fittest or cyber fittest, in effect. Someone who can handle that. Basically, that suggests it's not just a simple vertical silo. It's not something that can be handled in a simple way. It has to be a much broader understanding.
I think you've got to factor the human into the equation, and not in a sort of, scientific or computer science or infosec science way of sort of an approximation of what it is to be human. When we talk about protecting critical infrastructure, what is the most critical infrastructure that we're trying to protect? It's humans, it's us, our families, our communities, our cities, our nations. That's what we're trying to protect, is the humans.
From your research and all that you've seen in your studies, how much more vulnerable are we now? The fact we all have devices, young people have access to almost everything. You say cyber psychology, the impact of this technology on our minds, it must be pretty intense.
Well, when things go wrong, look, there are a lot of things that are great about tech. I was just asked earlier about internet addiction and how do I control my technology use. I'm probably the worst person. I'm a cyber psychologist. I spend a disproportionate amount of my time online. But the point is, in terms of you and I, we're sort of done, we're cooked. Like, not a lot is going to go wrong in terms of our neural activity and our use of technology. But the developing child, when I see 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds with mobile phone devices, when, millions of neurons are making connections, we have to think about that. There's a great paper by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it's called The Good, the Bad, and the Unknown. I worry about the unknown in terms of the impact of technology on the developing child.
How much real thought is being given to this right now? Because everyone seems to run at such a fast pace. Do people pay enough attention to this potential unknown?
I think that to a certain extent, parents have sort of given up. It's too much. They're trying to manage and juggle their busy lives. The kids seem happy on their devices. And there's not enough education and awareness raising about the impact of that technology in a good way, in terms of like enhancing fine motor skills and, the deficits associated with that and the problems associated with age-inappropriate use of technology. So I think we just have to be, we need, in the real world, we have ages of development. If you have children, you knew what age they should sit up and say their first words and take their first step. What's the equivalent in a cyber context in terms of ages of cyber development? And how do we inform parents about that?
Now, when people talk about cyber threats, cyber attacks and so on, I know you also have a very clear perspective on this because they do vary.
Yes, again, we were discussing earlier and somebody was saying, a cyber attack is a major event and then everything else should be considered a cyber incident. I don't agree with that. If somebody broke into your home and hit you over the head and went upstairs and pulled up your mattress and took, your savings, $10,000 from under your bed, that's an attack. When somebody is targeted online in terms of cyber fraud or extortion in terms of an investment that goes wrong, which is, cyber fraudulent investment, and somebody loses their life's savings and they're humiliated and incredibly depressed as a result, that's an attack. If a young boy is coerced into a relationship online and then sextorted as a result, that's an attack. If a small business is held to ransom and people lose their livelihood in terms of a ransomware attack, that's not an incident. That is an attack.
How do you regard disinformation and deep fakes and fake news? What sort of attack do they present then?
I think disinformation, and we've seen in the UK recently how disinformation online can lead to public disorder. And, there's a symbiotic relationship between cyberspace and the real world. What happens in cyberspace impacts the real world. What happens in the real world impacts cyberspace. So when you get this massive amounts of mis and disinformation online, it can lead to public order incidents. I mean, we saw that with the March on Capitol Hill in the US. And mis and disinformation, the potential impact in terms of elections. Mis and disinformation for young people. There was a recent piece of research, and something like 60% of young people thought that mainstream media was disinformation, fake news. So how are we going to maintain social order and civil society when people can no longer trust sources?
You're a pioneer in cyber psychology, and AI has come in now. Everything's moving so fast. How hard is it for you to keep up, and what impact is AI going to have?
Oh, I can beat AI any day, hands down. I mean, I've got a 1,000,000-year-old piece of technology that's been in development for 1,000,000 years, the human brain. On any given day, that is going to beat AI. AI, we mistake it as human intelligence because it can do some things incredibly quickly. That's not intelligence. That's just a task. That's like sweeping versus using a hoover. It's not intelligence. As a behavioral scientist, I can categorically say that we barely understand how the human brain works. To create something that replicates something we don't understand, it's a false premise. So I think what we have to do is look at not AI replacing humans, but IA, intelligence augmentation, the work of Licklider, who wrote in 1950 about man-computer symbiosis. that symbiotic relationship between man and machine, placing the human at the center of the decision-making process.
Let's end with perhaps 3 bullet point pieces of advice to people on how they can build their sense of strength against this, how they can, if you like, manage their cyber psychology.
I think the first thing that people need to do is understand the potential impact of technology on their lives. The second thing they've got to do is educate themselves about what the possibilities are and what strategies they could deploy. And then the third strategy is actually deploy. Do it. Just do it.
Dr. Mary Aiken, what a pleasure. Thank you so much. I look forward to speaking with you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,